Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of Iblis Manifestations podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the very challenging topic of Iran. As I'm sure many of you might be aware, Iran is indeed my home country, which I grew up in. I was born and raised there, and after a certain point in close to my young adulthood, I would say, I decided to move out of that country, and I moved to the UK, and it's been great for me because I've been able to do the things that I needed to do over here, which was, of course, to be able to freely express myself with music and other things, which I would not have been able to do in Iran. Hence why, ever since my visit here, I've always been a big proponent of free speech. As I'm sure those of you who are returning to the podcast are already aware of this, but I think it's important to retouch these points. Now, why would I have left in the first place? Well, there's a certain thing about the nature of the country and the nature of the political powers in charge, which I think that is very relevant for you all to know. Now, I understand that many of you might already be vaguely aware of the conditions in Iran. In some cases, you might think is worse than it is. In some other ways, you might think that it's a lot better than it actually is, when in reality, the conditions can be quite tragic. Now, on today's episode, I had the absolute privilege to have my friend Parsa. And Parsa is a fellow Iranian who's born and raised in America, in Atlanta. And he is also an activist. And he's someone who is also very knowledgeable on this. So it was really helpful to have him on this podcast, to have him help me with the challenging conversations and also the challenging history of our country. And he is also, in his activist work, he also works with certain organizations such as Azadi Daily, as well as various others. And I'm going to link all of that in the description for you guys to go and check out if you wish. And perhaps you can educate yourself further through those mediums as well. But the purpose of our conversation on this particular episode was mainly down to just trying to understand why Iran is the way that it is. How did it become in such a way? Why do so many people want to leave? Why are so many people protesting and rioting over there? And I'm sure that we've all seen this in the last year or so with the Mahsa Amini situation, where the mainstream has finally shown some light over the situations in Iran. But really, this has been going on for quite some time, since 1979 to be exact. So what we did, we took the history of the country, we dissected it as in as much of a summarized version as you could. And we also then went over the religious connotations of the government, because the government, as you understand, is the Islamic government, and it's called the Islamic Republic of Iran for a reason. And what does that actually mean as far as the laws of the country are concerned? Well, it means that the religion is going to be taken quite literally in the very sense of the legal system itself and how the government rules over the population. Now that, I'm sure you can all already see the writing on the wall there, but what we did is we actually dissected this for you guys so you can understand what that actually means and the conditions which it creates for people, not just on a social level, but even for an emotional level, and what it actually means to live in that environment, and how much it can actually feel like a prison for a lot of people. And I have to admit, myself included in that, during my time there, and still to a degree, I feel like I still am confined by that somehow. But without giving away too much of what we talked about, this was a very long, very challenging, but also very important conversation that Parsa and I had. And I hope that this will bring you the information necessary to try and understand Iran from the perspective of Iranians, not some mainstream news channel, and likewise not some conspiracy theorist who has never ever been to Iran yet fantasizes about the laws and regulations that the government has in place. This is a nuanced conversation between people who've experienced this, and they know what it's like, and they know what it's like to carry such a powerful and rich history and yet be enslaved to such unfortunate conditions in the modern world. So we got to describe that. There's a lot of facts, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of religion, but there are also emotions, there is also opinions. So it is a very human conversation in the end. And I want you to consider that. So it may not be perfect, but it is human. And more than anything, you know that it's going to be honest. And everything that we talked about comes from an honest place. And Parsa and I, perhaps we don't even agree 100% on everything. But the thing that we do 100% agree on is the fact that we want the best for Iran. And more importantly, the Iranian people. Okay? So that is the basic summary of this episode. Now, before I continue to that, I have to also acknowledge, I suppose, the elephant in the room here, that Parsa and I actually recorded this conversation prior to the 7th of October, where the terrorist group Hamas attacked Israel and killed and tortured a lot of innocent people. And this also happened to coincide with a lot of my own friends being present in Tel Aviv due to a black metal festival which was taking place. And in fact, at least 3 of those people have been guests on this very podcast previously. So for many reasons, this is something that hits home for me, and I have been asked a lot to voice my opinions and my concerns about it. Which side do you stand on? What are you thinking? Oh, can you please voice your concern? Okay, well, first and foremost, I absolutely condone the attacks of Hamas. It is unjustified. The killing of innocent people, the horrific treatment of people who are simply there to enjoy a music festival. How can anyone not condone that? I do not understand. So let me be extremely clear that I absolutely do not condone them. I think that they are a terrorist group, and I think that they should be stopped. A very important aspect of this is also the fact that Hamas are being directly funded by Iran. So I don't want to, I think that you can see exactly where this is going. And of course, we will talk about that. And, the politics of that region are extremely complicated. And the thing that disappoints me the most is the fact that people immediately jump to side. And, we have this tribalism about ourselves as human beings, which I do actually, to an extent, think that it can be quite beneficial, especially if you want to put that tribalism in a sense of, I suppose, decentralized tribalism, where people have their own communities, they have their own ideologies, and they can grow and they can prosper away from a centralized system. That is something that I do respect. But on the other hand, the very unfortunate thing that I find is that the way these things, these news narratives and these coverages, the way they spread like wildfire in our world, it hijacks that tribalism aspect of our human brains. And we immediately are prone to want to pick a team. We immediately jump to conclusion. We immediately get emotional about something. Like you have to think that a lot of times, much of what we believe is based on the information that we have been presented. Okay? Now, a lot of people will simply watch a video on YouTube and they will look at an argument between two people. Hypothetically, let's say one person is pro-Palestine, one person is pro-Israel. Those people will look at the argument between those people and they'll simply judge, oh, which one of these people do I like more? And then they'll make their entire judgment based on that. And from there on, that's their hill to die upon. They're like, okay, I'm team this, I'm team that. This is very frustrating to me because I want you to understand that these are not fucking football teams. There's innocent people dying on both sides. This is a tragedy. We first and foremost must acknowledge that this is a tragic thing which is happening. And to fall into the weaponization of this tragedy is a tragedy in itself. Now, again, you can look into the history of it, and I think that the history in this particular case is extremely relevant. And I guess that you can all draw your own conclusions from that. Okay? And I will also say that I am extremely disappointed in seeing all of those people from both sides, actually, that are celebrating the fact that the other side is getting attacked. Because what you're doing, you're feeding into this war, you're feeding into a conflict, and the fact that within your own humanity, you have justified the killings of innocent people. Because that is what you are doing. And that's... Where the fuck are we going with this? Why are we doing this? It's insane. It's insane. We all need to take a step back and rather than jump to conclusions, rather than act emotionally, we need to assess these things. Now, of course, when we have the proper information, like, for example, I know a lot of people are saying that how did the greatest intelligence group in the world did not know that such an attack was happening when Egypt already warned them and things like that. And then some people will then compare that to 9/11. We all know what happened there. I understand that. But there are certain sensitive information that perhaps you and I might not know about. And I think it's foolish for us to jump to conclusions to then immediately justify the killings of innocent civilians and people. I think that is very unfortunate. And you also have to understand that the more you attack a group of people, the more they're going to then want to unite with their governing authorities, when really it's the governing authorities that are the fucking problem to begin with. Anyhow, there's not much more point in me trying to add to this, but I've given my opinion. I do not condone the violent and killings of innocent people who are simply just trying to live their lives and enjoy themselves. Okay? And I think that these actions are absolutely despicable. And also there is the subject of religion as well, and Islam, which I've been very vocal about for the longest time. Don't know if it's necessary for me to talk about it much further beyond this point. And I do have to say that what I'm saying may not reflect the views of the guest which I'm about to have on this podcast. But it is very important that I voice these concerns. And I just really, really wish that, as emotionally charged as this situation is, and as easy as it is for many of us to want to jump to conclusion, or many of us have already had these pent-up feelings from the past, let's just take a step back. Let's just think for a moment. Let's perhaps try and educate ourselves rather than immediately pick a team and start bombarding social media with some flag emojis. That's all that I ask, is to just think, at least. Okay? Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this episode of Iblis Manifestations. This one is called Let's Talk About Iran. And shortly, myself and my guest will be doing exactly just that. I hope that you will enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Parsa Garrett to Iblis Manifestations. All right, Parsa, good evening and welcome to Iblis Manifestations. We're just about to have arguably the most different episode of the podcast ever, and I'm very pleased to have you on the show. However, just to sort of clean the slate here, I really need to speak to you about something which you and I spoke about on the phone previously. And it's the fact that as a Persian, you do not enjoy korma sabzi. So I would really like to address this criminal behavior before we proceed with the remaining parts of the podcast.
Well, thanks for calling me out publicly in front of everyone. Yeah, I have a very sensitive, it's something from when I was a kid, a very sensitive sense of smell and also like texture with food. And I had this thing about braised meats when I was younger, and it kind of just like traumatized me as a kid. So like, and I'm going to get a lot of crap for this take. My view on a lot of herbs like cilantro and like other like saffron even, which I love Persian ice cream, which has a bunch of saffron on it. That's about the exception.
Good stuff.
But these are, to me, they're like garnishes or accents to food. Iranians take it to another level where they will like take a whole bunch of these herbs, and that's like the one like main core in your face, like full blast of like cilantro in your face, like flavor. And for me, it's like a little much. I do like a lot of other Persian foods. Unfortunately, that is not one of them. And sometimes I have to like hang my head in shame when I go to Persian gatherings.
Well, I think plenty of grandmothers all across Iran are currently crying after hearing the thing. But no, listen.
I was hoping this would never get out, but here we are. I'll own it happily.
We had to start, so now that we've got that out of the way. Now, Parsa, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show, man. I think this is going to be a very special one. I guess the best place to really start is if you can just tell people a little bit about your background and if you can give us a little bit of a brief into your work as an activist, really.
Yeah, so my name is Parsa Garrett. I'm an Iranian-American. I was born in the United States. I did grow up visiting Iran. A lot of my summers were spent there. It's been quite a while since I've been to Iran. Unfortunately, can't really go back anytime soon. But grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Actually, my one of my best closest friends is Scott Taysom, the singer of Cloak, who you recently had on your podcast. Actually, kind of how me and you got connected.
That's right.
And so I grew up in Atlanta. I went to Georgia Tech, where I got a bachelor's degree in international affairs. And then I went to law school and became a lawyer, which is currently what I do as far as my everyday job. I also got a master's degree in international economics with a focus on the Middle East, particularly trying to kind of focus on Iran as much as I could, wherever my school kind of had opportunities to learn about it. Mm-hmm. So for the past 8, 9, however long years, I've been practicing as an attorney. I've always cared. I'm a business and corporate attorney, so total sellout. I've given up to the man in every way, but I kind of do my normal like corporate law work on a day-to-day basis. In
other words, you have the patience of a saint. That's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm the type of person that like, I put my head down, I kind of focus on one thing, and nothing like kind of really gets in my way of making that thing happen, whether it's my job or whether it's like wanting to learn like a specific thing on guitar or something like that. Scott Taysom and I actually played in a band together, which he talked about on the episode when I was in college, but then I moved away. So yeah, I've been practicing law for the past several years. And then right when COVID happened, I picked up a hobby of photography. I started mostly doing street photography, just kind of wandering around and just taking photos of whatever it was that interests me, maybe some cars, just people walking around. And then a little over almost exactly a year ago, September 16th, Mahsa Amini was killed in Iran for, she was taken into custody by the so-called morality police in Iran, and for improperly wearing her hijab. Maybe had a few strands of hair showing. And while she was taken into custody, she was beaten so badly that she went into a coma and later died in the hospital. And as we've all seen, as many people are likely aware, the past year has been riddled with protests and people calling for the downfall of the Islamic Republic in Iran. During that time, my photography hobby kind of turned, like my sights were kind of set on a different thing. I just happened to go to a protest here in Atlanta that it was in the first week or so of the protests starting, because the protests weren't really just, there was a protest in Iran, which is the most important ones, right? Those are the people that are risking their lives. But this also, what you saw kind of across the entire world was Iranians in the diaspora that have become implants, all of whom have pretty much been displaced by the Islamic Republic, people who fled Iran. They were rising up in their respective cities, calling on action for their governments to support the protesters, protesting against the regime. I went to the first one in Atlanta and just had my camera on me. I was like, I'm going to take my camera and take pictures. Mm-hmm. So took pictures, and I've talked about this, before on a few other discussions that I've had, but went to another protest the next week, kept doing it. I would post my pictures on social media. Then I had a trip planned to LA that was already to go see family. And while I was LA, for people who don't know, has the largest population of Iranians outside of Iran, like in the world. Toronto might be getting close to eclipsing that. I'm not sure.
That's why we call it Tehrangeles.
Yeah, the nickname for it is Tehrangeles. So yeah. I was like, well, when I'm in LA, like I can't turn my head without hearing Farsi. Like I see it everywhere. I see the Iranians everywhere. So I knew, they were going to have massive protests. And the day I landed, there was a protest that day, and I went straight to it. Got in the rental car, went straight to the protests from the airport, and there was 30,000 people there. And so I had my camera on me, and I was taking pictures, and I was there for the next 2 weeks, and there was like 3 other events. So I'm taking these pictures, posting them, and they're starting to just get a little bit more noticed. Iranians starting to follow my account. Next thing I know, I'm going back to Atlanta. Then I'm going to DC. I'm going to New York, some of which were planned trips, but it started getting to a point where I was planning travels for my photography to document these protests out, because this was the first time in history the Iranian diaspora had really risen up. Like people from all sorts of ideological backgrounds that are outside of Iran had risen up together in like this unified voice against the Islamic Republic. And I was following it all over North America. I even went to Toronto, I went to Montreal, had a few opportunities to connect with other artists, other activists. So it's kind of gotten to and then I've kind of started taking my photography to another level where I was getting more involved in doing educational content, making videos that weren't just featuring my photography. I'm also now part of a team called Azadi Daily, which we have an Instagram account that is dedicated to civil resistance in Iran. And that the objective of that page is, one, informational, but also educational. So actually providing information, one of our, like the things that we're currently doing is educational content about democracy, because in Iran, you don't learn about democracy in schools. So we have, that's not something that they teach in Iran. They don't teach about free political discourse, free thought and things like that. So our content is in English and Farsi, and we are actually sifting through thousands I can't take credit for this part of it. People on our team are sifting through thousands and thousands of pages of actual political science research that is rooted in studies, and this is educational and academic research related to revolutions, civil resistance, effective strategies. What are the requirements for a successful revolution? And not just to have a revolution, but a revolution that leads to a democracy successfully. And
very important, yeah.
Right. So we're trying to create this educational content, and we're putting it in Farsi, and we also create videos out of it. So we've had a few videos that we've put out that just talk about the basic principles of a democracy, and then hoping that this gets in the hands of people, even especially youth and young people in Iran who do have access to internet and are very technologically savvy and very advanced compared to the criminals that are running the government over there. But just putting this in like a basic form and condensing this thousands and thousands of pages of research and pulling the critical information out of it that people need to understand in order to have a successful revolution and to have effective means of civil resistance that can hopefully one day lead to the downfall of the Islamic Republic. So I will kind of stop there, but that's kind of a high level of my activism work as it relates to Iran. And I have some other projects that are more on the cultural front and artistic front. I'll just name it really quick. It's a new organization called Nimruz that a few very close friends of mine have founded, and it's actually very closely tied to the Humans of New York story that recently came out. That was a 57 part. It was 52 or 57 part story about a man named Parsa Zafari. And his experience, and it was an incredible story. And it's actually the grandsons of Parviz who have founded this new organization, who are good friends of mine, and who I'm hoping to be able to help them as much as I possibly can with the mission of this organization, really trying to bring forward Iranian art, culture, and tie that back to the common things that unite us in order to. And activism is a huge part of it, right? Like really focused on these elements of our Iranian identity that actually unite us rather than divide us, and those specifically being our art and our ancient philosophies. So
absolutely. Well, first of all, all my respect to yourself and everyone else who has been dedicating time to this, I suppose, like you said, cultural and political education, which is really the thing that's been lacking. And I think part of the reason why the government has had the stronghold that it's had over the people, now we can talk about the region and the geopolitical aspect of it, but just over the people of Iran, that's a big part of it, is lack of education. And instead just feeding people with propaganda, and that's the propaganda that I personally grew up around. So I'm very much familiar with that, and when you say that the idea of democracy is not something that's openly discussed, just as like a little anecdote, I remember very vividly being sat in class during our high school years, so perhaps it wasn't too long before I eventually left, maybe a few years. And I remember seeing one of our, we had this guy who was a religious teacher, but also slash, like the social studies class as well. And I remember him sat there sort of with his legs crossed on the table, just looking at the ceiling saying, yes, one day we will destroy Israel. One day we will, and that's the, and that's like, and all the kids are like just looking at him like, yeah, okay, sure. And it's like kind of like, now you can then get into that topic as well, but just the idea that this is the environment of the schools, that, 10, 11-year-olds are being told like that one day we will destroy so-and-so country, because they're infidels, they're this and that, and that idea alone, I think, is a very dangerous thing. It doesn't matter which side of the coin you're picking. I think that's the kind of propaganda that we're all living in, and you dare to question that and then you can get fucked, which I did at one point, actually. So we'll get into all of that. But I think to sort of bring this back a little bit, the thing that I feel would be very good for our Western, or should I say English-speaking listeners who are currently going through this podcast, is to first and foremost try and dissect parts of the history of Iran and what's even led to it being in the position that it is now, and also try and relate that to what importance does Iran play now in 2023 in comparison to the rest of the world, and this sort of boogeyman position that they've had since 1979 all across the world, really. So I think that would probably be the best way to I think go further to try and educate our friends, really. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds good. One thing I'll say is I'm I'm an Iranian. I have my own, especially as someone who was born in the United States, I certainly have my own experience of what it means to be an Iranian with kind of my background. I'm by no means a historian, but I do have probably a little bit more familiarity with it than some of the non-Iranian audience here. But me, like anyone else, Iran is by no means a monolith. So my view on these things is certainly inspired by my experiences, my life, my own biases, my own opinions. Iran is a very diverse country with a lot of different lived experiences in it. So people, I might say something or might have a take on something that not everyone agrees with, or that is, maybe not even accurate. So any listeners in there, if you have different experiences, I'm always open to hearing them. I would love to try to give as much voice to the Iranian people and people in Iran as much as I possibly can. So I do strive for that. But, as someone who has their own experiences with an American identity as well, like there are going to be shortcomings that are inherent in my views or the things that I say or even the information that I have. Right. But I try to stick with facts are facts as much as possible. Like everyone's entitled to their own views. Not everyone is not entitled to their own facts.
Well, I'm sure that once we start to dissect things, there perhaps might even be, as I said to you before, we might even come to a point where you and I might have a different viewpoint. And I encourage that in a sense, because then we get to discuss that and then see, oh, okay, well, why is this? And then what's this difference, and then how did we lead to different conclusions? Obviously, so far, we've been on the same page on pretty much everything. But, I think I'm open to that. That's the point of having a podcast like this.
Absolutely.
To try and uncover the real truth that's in the gray areas a lot of times.
Absolutely.
I think we can probably point out that obviously Iran before the Islamic Republic was a very different entity as far as being a country was concerned. Now, things were in many ways headed down south, but I think as a very general overview, it's probably important to mention to people that the Persian Empire goes as far as back as 4,000 years, going back to the period of the Achaemenid Empire when you had Cyrus the Great, and probably ironically, the first traces of what we know as democracy were actually originating back to the time of Persepolis and that time. So obviously we've had a very rich and very extensive history, and the Persian Empire at one point went all the way from northwest India all the way to Turkey, which if you look at that, that's a very, very large portion of the map. And and we can look at what it was like during the period of Nader Shah. Obviously, this is at a time where the world basically runs on colonialism and slavery and intense fucking wars and battles. So it was a brutal environment, but we have a lot behind us as far as a nation, but also a heritage. There's a lot that's there, but I think the point where we can start focusing on things where it becomes relevant, very relevant to where we are now, is probably from the Pahlavi dynasty.
Yeah, I agree. I think, of course, our history goes back thousands and thousands of years. Historically, we practice Zoroastrianism, a religion which actually still exists today, and I think has a lot of valuable lessons tied to it. I think it's actually now one of the oldest religions still practiced, one of the oldest, like that was condensed to like a written form that's like still practiced today. Of course, Iran is now like 99% Muslim. through some Arab Islamic conquest. But yeah, historically we have, I would say that our history has
Sorry
democratic...
to interrupt you there, man. Sorry to interrupt you there, but also I would say that they might be 99% Muslim on the paper, but there's a very large percent of Iranians who are at this point almost genocidally anti-Islam, which
for sure
they have the right to feel that way also.
Yeah, I mean, and that's 100% totally understandable. I think in terms of the infrastructure behind like the current Iranian system is still like very much whether you are Muslim or not, like everything that is like has been built up by the regime is guided by Muslim theocratic beliefs. So like they have certainly tried to erase significant elements of our values and culture. But we've also historically retained one thing I want to mention is, Iranians, in spite of the Islamic conquest I think it was the year 620 to 50, around that age when after the Prophet Muhammad came, and then the caliphates kind of formed after that. Iranians historically have had a lot of resistance to the Arab efforts at Islamic conquest. So our language is a huge part of that. Our poetry, our music, this type of Islam that was practiced 1400 years ago, which the Islamic Republic has tried to bring back today, was very opposed to things like poetry and music and dance. Iranians, in spite of the religious shift that the country may have seen, retained all elements of their culture, and some of them still today. For example, our holiday Nimruz is rooted in Zoroastrian traditions, and that's only celebrated in Iran. And when I think of that holiday, just the mere practice of that holiday, which the Islamic Republic tried to ban unsuccessfully, the mere practice of that holiday is a form of resistance that Iranians are still practicing today.
Absolutely. And also, that's a very fair point. It's essentially, to anyone listening, it's basically like it's like a pagan holiday. It's like Christmas without the Christ, where it's just a Yule. That's kind of what Nowruz is. But also saying that, I don't think a figure like Haji Firuz would go down very well on the streets of a Western country.
Probably not. I think a lot of people might see that and think that it's so. For people not listening, Haji Firuz is a character in our Nowruz holiday who is his face is covered in soot, and people might see that and think that it's blackface. It's not obviously that. But yeah. I have actually read, and I don't know the specifics of it though, that there are some, that is a disputed, there's some disputes about the origins of Haji Firuz, that some people think he actually might be rooted in some sort of like, tied back to some slave or something like that. I don't know the actual origins. We don't really need to get into the details of it, but there is some dispute about his origins. But yeah, if you see Haji Firuz ever being celebrated by a bunch of Iranians, just know that the intent behind that is not blackface. It's a very different meaning.
Yeah, very well put. Myself and a friend of mine from Zimbabwe, I showed him that. I was like, what do you make of this? And he was shocked at first, but then we were kind of laughing about it, and it's like you said, it's not anything done with ill intent, but part of, like I said earlier, I like to kind of pick faults with what we've got going on.
Yeah, maybe we should revisit that one just to be safe.
Yeah. But yeah, so you were saying, that obviously we've got all these ancient tradition, and Zoroastrianism. And as far as I think just even religious philosophy is concerned, I think Zoroastrianism is like one of the most humanitarian practices there has been amongst religious ideologies, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Cyrus the Great, who is by many considered to be the greatest king in Iran's history, is known as kind of like the world's first like humanitarian leader. He invented the Cyrus cylinder, which is an artifact currently sitting in a British museum. which I hope one day, which is not surprising, but I hope one day when Iran is free and the Cyrus cylinders and our artifacts are actually safe from the Islamic Republic, who would potentially seek to destroy those artifacts, like they've done many of our artifacts and our ancient shrines and things like that. I hope to one day see those things return back to Iran when it's safe to do so. But that Cyrus cylinder is a stone like manuscript. It has what's viewed as the world's first declaration of human rights written on it, right. And that's a huge point of pride for a lot of Iranians, in that historically our civilization pre-Islamic conquest was one. The Persian Empire was huge, but one of the things that made the empire so successful was the fact that the Iranian kings would allow the regions where they would conquer to continue to practice their own religious and cultural practices, and did not ban those practices, and would even allow them to have their own leaders continue to govern those areas as governors that effectively paid tribute to not I don't want to like whitewash any form of like imperial conquest of any kind. Like there's downsides to all of it. But relatively speaking, that there's fundamental Iranian like philosophies that are very contradictory to what the Islamic Republic practices today, that we have practiced for thousands of years, that I think can in certain ways serve as a point of pride for many Iranians.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. I was thinking that just a moment ago, that we've got all of these things that we take pride in, and yet our country is basically, the way I always like to look at it, and I've said this on the podcast before, but it always feels like Iran is taken hostage, so like our country, our heritage, our land is taken hostage by a group of supposed clerics, who want to revolutionize the world with their Islamic viewpoint, a Shia one at that, which if you really want to know what that is, I mean, one thing that I always find is ironic at best is the fact that the English writing for Shia practice, or someone who does the Shia practice, is Shiite. It's shite basically in English. That's and it's like you can't make that up. That's the perfect way to describe it. It's shite. Yeah,
so, I mean, I don't want to knock anyone who pursues a particular religious faith. However, with the caveat that when your religion is operating at the expense of other human beings, and is enslaving other human beings, whether it's women or other ethnic minorities who don't practice your religion. Any practice of religion taken to an extreme. Now, I do have views about what Islam is at its core and inherently, and that's probably something that I think can apply to many religions. And in terms of the views of the founders of these religions and stuff like that. If someone wants to live their life in a peaceful way without disturbing other people and not at the expense of other people, I don't go do your thing. Like, I have no issue with it. I might have my views about what your religion is, or what it was at its core when it was founded. But yeah, anyone who is practicing the Islam of the Islamic Republic today, shite is an apt word.
You point on something important. I actually think, I'm glad that the topic of religion came up. Perhaps we should have even intentionally decided to talk about this first, because I think religion plays a very big part in why we are in the mess that we currently are at the moment. And, speaking of Islam, and particularly the Shiite version of it, I think one thing that I've always said is, you want to quit drinking, you want to stop looking at other women who you are not married or related to in an inappropriate way, if you want to start fasting, if you want to give away charity, if you want to do all of these things, I think they're absolutely noble, okay? But they should be your choice. And these things are not things that, first of all, should be imposed on other people, But
yeah, I mean, you don't want to look at women, put your fucking head down.
Like, yeah. Yeah. You don't have to make a whole religion out of it, just because, your brain doesn't exist outside of your dick. So the way I look at it is, what I think is that all these things are very noble, So Islam, if you want to look at it from a point of personal practice that only affects you, I think it can be very beneficial. If anything, personally, now this other Iranians listening to this will not be able to relate to what I'm saying at all, but I don't drink. I have quit drinking. I like to be sober, okay? And I know that's like for Iranians outside of Iran, they're like, what the fuck, I'm the infidel to them, right? But here's the thing, and of course I've got history of doing it, but I do that for personal reasons, and it's more a matter of preference. But that's for me to decide that that's what I want to do. That shouldn't be the government's job to tell me to do that, and then if I break that habit, then I'm gonna get fucking 80 lashes for it, get 3 months in prison, and then on the third or fourth time get executed for it. So the problem with Islam in general is that when it's down to the individual, if it's one individual's relationship with their God, with Allah, all absolutely fine. But it becomes a problem because that book has an invasive agenda to it. And by that book, I'm speaking about the Quran. The Quran wants to invade you. So the thing with Muslims is I've listened to enough of them speak, and at some point, in fact, I would love to debate one on the show. But one thing that they always say is that, and I'm speaking of the ones outside of Iran as well, they'll always be saying things along the lines of, well, Allah says slavery is okay because, that furthers our message, and it's a part of what we do. It strengthens our bonds. And then, and of course we are here to convert as many people to Islam. Of course we're doing that. And then on the other hand, they will also simultaneously play the victim. Oh, the West is trying to reject Islam, all our people are victims. They're trying to get kicked out of their homes. It's like, motherfuckers, you follow a faith that does not respect our human rights and liberties. You follow a religion that at its very core stands against everything that makes us free as human beings. And you still expect and demand that you're respected for it? And it's not like you demand by your speech, you demand by committing crimes against the rest of humanity. And I think that the whole idea, like I said, it can be noble, but it's inherently made to invade other parts of the world. In school, like the same guy that I said was talking about Israel, that same guy would also say that, oh, one day 90% of the population of the world will be Muslim. And by that time, anyone else who's not Muslim, they're infidels. They're off to be killed. So as long as they're in the minority, they play the victim. As soon as they have the upper hand, they want to kill everyone else who's not a part of their group. And I think that this is something that people need to strongly consider when it comes to how they view and perceive Islamic ideology. And also one of the things that I find extremely baffling, that especially a lot of people on the left will then try to defend Islam just so that they appear diverse when it's really the most right-wing ideology there is on the planet.
Well, I definitely agree with a lot of the points that you've raised. In particular, I happen to be pretty liberal myself, pretty generally progressive. However, there is a lot of whitewashing of Islam that happens by people on the left, especially people who are not Muslim, because they think they might be afraid of getting canceled for appearing Islamophobic, or they've been told that the practice of these certain Islamic rituals is actually empowering, and I try to be mindful of people's, for example, people might have different interpretations about whether the hijab, for example, is empowering to women or is. And I know in the UK that and in France that debate happens quite a bit, or whether or not it's actually oppressive. And we don't have to get into the ins and outs of that. But I do think that anyone can. I don't have issue with people who want to kind of make religion personal for them and pull the aspects of their religion that they do resonate with and kind of create their own custom version of it. that's fine to me. However, there is a degree of whitewashing of your religion that has to happen in order for you to get to that point. And so if you stay now, and there are plenty of Muslim women who speak out very bravely against, especially in Iran, devout Muslim women who speak out bravely against, imposed religious practices, Sharia law, and stuff like that. But they are still at their core, Muslim. However, with that said, there are elements of the core of the religion that shouldn't be ignored. The people who are responsible for founding Islam, and same with the people who founded Christianity and a lot of these other religions that go through like this phase of conquest, they are spread through warfare, through rape, through pillaging, through extreme forms of racism against people who don't. So why are you looking to these people to guide your ideology? Like, these are the people who created your religion, and you think it still has relevance today. So you want to look at the positive parts of it that you're able to pull out and make your own, but just ignore. I'm sorry, but like, I don't trust the people who wrote the Bible or the people who wrote the Quran to have any degree of education or knowledge about what is true and what is the truth today. Like, we are now that like 2,000 years removed from, and more advanced. And I don't want to stray too far from like the purpose of the discussion, but yeah, I mean, one thing I want to address that you commented was that these people who practice this form of extreme ideology, it feels like we've been taken hostage by them. Mm-hmm. While I agree with that sentiment in general, and I think there's certainly truth to it, I think a lot of what happens, and maybe this is how we can we wanted to talk about the Pahlavi era a little bit in terms of the history. I do feel like sometimes a lot of Iranians maybe push away taking responsibility for the things that led to this. And the things and a lot of responsibility, a lot of things that could have happened that didn't, that Iranian people either allowed or supported, that ultimately resulted in it. And so, for example, the Pahlavi era was started by Reza Shah after the fall of the Qajar dynasty, right? So Reza Shah had a military background, extremely disciplined, and is responsible for a lot of modernization of Iran. We had no paved roads before he took power. Then we had thousands of miles of paved road. He brought education. He lifted the mandatory hijab. He brought a whole new era of education. A middle class started growing in Iran. So rapid modernization. And his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, who was the last Shah of Iran, continued a lot of that. Both of those individuals, and there was a series of steps, especially a lot of foreign involvement, particularly and we can talk about that, but by the American government and the UK government, that created a lot of challenges for Iran, a lot of interference that really contributed to what we have today. Yep. But both of those leaders were kings that had dictatorial characteristics to them. So while we had modernization and you had the ability to go out and wear whatever you want, dance, sing, you had women's rights to a degree that you certainly don't even have close to that in Iran today. We did not have where they fell short was political freedom, right? Freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and being able to express your thoughts. So especially in the 20 years leading up to the Islamic Republic, Reza Pahlavi, although I do think at his core, loved Iran and cared about Iran quite a bit, what we didn't have in Iran for decades was an environment where political freedom and political expression was encouraged. In fact, you were risking your life if you spoke up against the king. He had Savak, which was a secret police that was its job was to go out there and root out dissent from people. And a lot of this led to a lot of social and political unrest that ultimately led to his downfall. But, you know, even when I think about people who talk, especially people outside of Iran who talk about Iran, you know, the glory days of Iran, and they look back on it with so much positives, like, you know, very positively. There's a lot of good things about what they did. However, those people who have those views also happen to be the people who benefited the most from the monarchy, right? And the people who had to flee. There were a lot of Iranians who were not in that same boat, and their struggle should not be ignored. And I've heard a lot of times people, especially outside diaspora, talk about, you know, the shame of the 1979 revolution, which of course there's a lot of shame associated with that. And some of them even hold resentment towards other Iranians for allowing it to happen, especially those people who weren't necessarily religious, but participated in the revolution. Well,
especially also the newer generation that are always criticizing the generation before for doing their revolution.
Yeah. And so, but like, let's look at like the conditions that led to it. One, Khomeini, who is the Ayatollah who founded the Islamic Republic, one, he lied about a lot of things. He lied about a lot of his ideologies. He did this populist form of Islam that tricked a lot of people. But had the Shah created an environment where political discourse was permitted, a lot of Iranians, especially the younger Iranians who participated in the revolution, didn't know what Khomeini really believed, because there was no forum for people to test ideas in Iran, in Iran, right? So people, you know, one, they were tricked, but also no one got to Iran had no experience with this idea of free speech for decades. So there wasn't a place where the people could go in universities. You know, we had a lot of people in universities. This was part of the modernization of Iran, but they were learning math and science. They weren't going and learning political science. They weren't learning about even maybe some elements of our history. You know, you would have some scholars and stuff, but that wasn't the primary focus. A lot of it was on technological science, like advancement, things that would bring Iran to a modern era. So if we had this forum and these spaces and these civil society groups that had existed in Iran, which the Shah prevented from happening, and you know, your life was at risk if you engaged in any of these sort of activities, it is very possible that these Muslim scholars and these Shiite clerics, I think, could have had their ideologies rooted out much earlier on, as part of just the natural process of political discourse and discussion. You know, in the West, we have debates that are televised. People get to test each other's ideologies. But even a lot of the young people who participated in the 79 revolution, who weren't part of the Islam, like the extremist religious groups that participated, didn't even really know who Khomeini was, right? Like, he was a relatively, but if we had people talk about, so like it was the monarchy itself that in its failings in allowing political freedom that allowed, that's a shortcoming of the monarchy and Reza Pahlavi, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's reign, is that by engaging in so much political oppression, he created the circumstances that ultimately led to his downfall. Whereas had this behavior been more encouraged, you know, allowing in political discussion and testing people's ideas and creating this political arena where you're free to criticize and free to actually explore people's thoughts, it is very possible that Khomeini's lies could have been rooted out much earlier on.
Absolutely. Well, you know, a couple of clarifications there, I think, you know, just to sort of tie things around. Obviously, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, he was the last Shah of Iran. He was the guy who basically, you know, he had to flee the country, and then Khomeini basically replaced him. Okay.
Yep.
That was the point of the country where we had, you know, we switched from a monarchy to a theocracy, which is basically the same shit, but 10 times worse. So I think that, you know, obviously Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi's position on things was there were a lot of flaws. I mean, there's so many details and different anecdotes that we can talk about. Even the claims that he was allegedly a homosexual, and then this other guy who was basically a jester that he used to spend time with was actually not allowed to visit Reza Shah's house, because allegedly he might have found them together or something. There's like all these different things, and then on the front, the guy was actually quite strongly homophobic. And, there's these things, now how much you want to pay attention to that part, that's its own thing. The thing that we really want to pay attention to is the fact that Mohammad Reza Shah, without a shadow of a doubt, had a lot of affection for Iran. He wanted Iran to modernize as much as possible, and he definitely made his efforts to make that come true to an 100%. Extent. So, for that, as sort of like, like yourself, I don't, I liked how you put things earlier where you said, you don't view this as Iran as a monolith or as such, and I think this is where it's good, where we can perhaps criticize parts of our history that led us down to where we are now. We can take responsibility for it, but also see the points where we did good. And, and to say that the Pahlavis didn't do any good, I think is very unfair. And
and there are a lot of people who take that stance, and I disagree with that sentiment completely. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, what I don't like to see is like cult-like idolatry of any one person. For whatever shortcomings he may have had, I do agree that I think he cared about Iran. He cared about its history. He cared about people say, oh, he was just a dictator. He didn't care about the people. He took everything from himself. I don't think that's true. But he's a man, right? And a lot of people today look back and look at, our kings as if they were gods and maybe not capable of any shortcomings. Yeah. And he had his flaws, just like any other ruler. And we have, in thousands of years of history, we have plenty of examples of Iranian kings that were good, some that were terrible, some that were neutral, some that were in between, but no one is without any shortcomings.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that we got to also consider is the fact that you could almost say that the same thing applies to the Islamic Republic with certain people within that group who've been around, but however, I think the problem with that is the fact that reform is not an option. But we will come back to that one. We will come back to that, okay? So I think just in the point of history, before we go into the fully fledged aspect of the Islamic Revolution, I think probably the important thing we can discuss is probably a figure called Mosaddegh. I think that's probably a good place where we can kind of go into, because that's kind of where there was a few feuds regarding oil with the British, and then a few meddlings by the West that led to basically the full scale downfall of what we knew of Iran before the Islamic Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mosaddegh is a very controversial figure. He's worshipped by many, hated by a lot of many, and I think he probably falls somewhere in between. And for the non-Iranian listeners who don't know who Mosaddegh is, I'm pretty sure every Iranian knows who he is. He was a lawyer educated in I want to say Switzerland, I believe. Iranian, and he had a very long political career. Actually served as prime minister in Iran around World War I time period, late, like maybe 1917 something. I could be off on my dates, but later in the 1950s, he was appointed as the prime minister of Iran by the Shah. So a lot of people make the claim that he was democratically elected. That's not technically correct. The prime minister was actually appointed by the Shah. So for various political reasons, Mosaddegh was appointed by the Shah as in an effort to kind of bridge the gap between himself and the people who wanted to see the monarchy have a little bit less power. So it was kind of a form of an appeasement to the population of Iran. And Mosaddegh was extremely popular. Mosaddegh, really believed in the power of the parliament and the prime minister over the power of the absolute power of a monarch. So he believed in the constitutional monarchy, but really thought that the Shah should be more of a figurehead, kind of like what you have in the UK. So where I think Mosaddegh probably maybe overplayed his hand a little bit and also suffered from some ego challenges himself was he started very rapidly trying to strip away the Shah's powers as a monarch, and ended up trying to vest those powers into himself as the prime minister, and then also tried to nationalize Iran's oil, which was a big no-no for the British, because the British at this point have a major stake in Iran, and especially in its oil, and they had a kind of a profit-sharing arrangement with the monarchy.
And the profit-sharing arrangement is an absolute fucking joke. Like, they're basically taking...
They're taking everything for themselves.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, they're taking everything and giving Iran peanuts in return.
Right. So Iran has now basically lost access to its own, the benefits of its oil and the profits that you see from it. So Mosaddegh was strongly opposed to this. And so he cut off all diplomatic ties with the British. And he started consolidating power away from the Shah and putting it in himself. And I think some of this maybe, if you wanted to have a process of a reform, was maybe done a little bit with a little bit too much ego, while I think maybe his intentions were good, but also very, very rapidly, and not something that was really done in any form of like collaborative effort. So the British ended up basically embargoing. They've now lost access to Iran. They put Iran under an embargo that would basically prevent them from being able to sell their oil. So Iran starts struggling a lot, right? Financially, economically, the people are hurting. Mossadegh's popularity starts declining because of the economic stagnation, but he's still pretty popular. MI6 and the UK are, obviously very keen on protecting their interest in Iran. Mosaddegh is not a cooperative partner for them, and a lot of people suspect, he was part of a kind of a united front of people that were more on the like left-leaning, and had even, some potential ties to the Soviet Union, which was a huge red flag for the British and the Americans.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was a part of the conversation. I can't recall. I think this might have been with Churchill, who actually expressed concerns about these potential ties. That, hey, this guy might actually be a communist, and then he's gaining all of this power, and then he's cut off our access to their oil and all of those things. So there was a consolidated effort to now basically try and move against Mosaddegh in Iran.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I don't think Mosaddegh himself was a communist. I do think, he was certainly more on the socialist side of the spectrum. I do think he was willing to do business with the Soviets for the sake of saying, fuck you to the British, right? He was willing to build these sort of alliances and relationships because there was so much disdain for the British at this time, given, how they had basically viewed themselves as entitled and the rightful owners of Iran's oil. So he was certainly willing to play, the Russian hand, in order to gain an advantage over the British. So,
and can we just say as well, because the thing here is that just to sort of clarify, if you want to strip down this idea and say that, okay, so this guy's come in, he's found out that the oil of his country is basically being rinsed by the British and they're getting nothing for it. So what he wants to do is to nationalize that and basically cut off that access where they're basically getting totally raped for the profits that they could be seeing, and instead invest that on the people. I think that's a very good-hearted
I agree.
move or intention, rather. But of course, as we always know, in politics, there's never any solutions. There's only trade-offs.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And I think this was a very good example of that. And also, we do have to acknowledge that Mosaddegh, obviously, as good-hearted as that idea might have been, first of all, the way that he went about it, like we pointed out, was somewhat extreme, especially doing that against the British. That's a big move. Like you said, there might have been a bit of ego involved there. We don't know. There's a lot of different intricacies involved here. But also that after that, he was doing certain deals behind closed doors and doing sneaky little things which weren't so good-hearted, if I want to put it in a very summarized version.
Yeah, while also consolidating power into his own seat, right? So like that, precisely. Right? So which is a huge issue. So from the Shah's perspective, I think the idea behind nationalizing Iran's oil is a noble one. And there are certainly, from my perspective, that oil belongs to Iran, not to the British. So I think there's plenty of issues with British imperialism around this time and colonial efforts.
Yeah.
I think, so at this point, you're right about a potential the perceived threat of a communist takeover in Iran, which was exactly what the British used to their advantage in convincing the Americans to get involved. Because I think the United States had kind of stayed relatively uninvolved in Iran compared to the British. As soon as they were convinced by the British, especially the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which I think now has become, was it British Petroleum, BP now today? I can't remember which oil company it is today, but
originally it was OPEC, wasn't it?
Oh, so OPEC is a organization of like collective countries and oil companies that kind of help determine the oil industry and pricing and how oil is distributed across the world. Gotcha. It's more of like a international cooperation related to oil. I can't say that I know like the nuances of it, but
it's the UN of oils, basically.
Sure. Yeah, let's put it that way. So now the British have told the Americans, hey, keep your eyes on Iran. There's a Soviet threat rising up in Iran, and now there's the Tudeh party in Iran, which was a Soviet leaning party. Like they had ties to the Russians, they were funded by the Russians, they believed in the same Soviet ideology, and a lot of times people would try to link Mosaddegh to the Tudeh party, saying he has Soviet leaning. So the British convinced the Americans that Mosaddegh is a pro-Soviet prime minister. Now the Americans are very interested, right? We're in the Cold War. They are keen on curbing the Soviet efforts wherever they can. So the CIA gets involved, and a man named Kermit Roosevelt, who is actually I believe, the nephew of Teddy Roosevelt, president.
That's right.
The nephew or grandnephew, I can't remember how many removed, but he is an agent for this. He was the CIA's Middle East agent. So he basically goes to the Shah and saying, we're going to get rid of Mosaddegh. Now, the Shah is very cautious about this because he understands Mossadegh's popularity in Iran, and how, what this could mean for him and his popularity if he just goes and gets rid of a prime minister. And long story short, eventually it's developed to a stage where there was an initial attempted coup where Mossadegh also played his hand. Is in Iran at the time, there was a law that said if the parliament was dissolved, that the Shah actually had the power to dismiss the prime minister when a parliament is dissolved, or like in times of war, for example. Mossadegh at this point, because of his economic economic instability, his popularity is waning and declining a little bit. He is still trying to prop himself up against the United States and the UK. There's some unrest politically for him, and he gets to a point where he just basically decides unilaterally to dissolve the parliament against the advice of a lot of people who were even close to him, who were his supporters. this was viewed as a very unpopular move at the time in Iran. And the Shah basically got to a point where he now technically had the legal authority to dismiss the prime minister, and he did dismiss the prime minister. Initially, the attempt failed. He sent someone saying that you need to step down. Mosaddegh then had the messenger of that arrested, but the CIA at this time is now orchestrating and paying off mobs and actually like gangster groups to play different sides in Iran. And so they've basically paid off this mob to appear at Mossadegh's house. And now you have you also have a few incidents of the police getting involved, the military getting involved, killing innocent people. This circumstance of chaos was created by the CIA paying off various groups and creating all this propaganda against Mosaddegh. Eventually,
which down the line actually massively backfired on them as well, but we will obviously get into that.
down the line it did for sure. And so eventually got to the point where the military now has surrounded Mossadegh's house and has him arrested. They basically call him, they actually went pretty lighter on him than you would expect. During the 3 days in which the coup was failed but then reattempted and taking place with all this chaos, they had looked at basically the Mossadegh's actions in that 3-day window and didn't try to come up and like create all this like historical stuff to totally diminish him and like degrade him. That would probably have been viewed as like an unpopular move given his long history in public service in Iran, how popular he was. But they basically just prosecuted him for like a series of quote unquote crimes in this 3-day window when he was resisting the Shah. And the Shah had fled Iran during this time and went to, I believe, Rome, and to kind of look like it wasn't his doing and like wash his hands of it. But we know that he was directly working with the CIA.
And actually, this time. We have to say that even though this was very much like a way to try and create propaganda and gaslight the people, the public were actually fairly aware of what had actually happened at this point.
I don't know how aware they were at the actual time of events, because a lot of people they were very they were subject to a lot of manipulation by the media and newspapers and propaganda that was being propped up by the CIA and the British. But it certainly got uncovered later on, probably pretty soon after. Mossaddegh ends up getting arrested. He spends I think 3 years in prison, then he's in exile in his home for house arrest for the rest of his life. But he died in
house arrest, didn't he?
Yeah, he did while he was under house arrest. Now he, considering how the Shah has treated other political dissidents, he probably I would say they probably let him off with a little bit more honor than they would have otherwise with other political dissidents. Not to say that it was just, or that the way that he was the prime minister or Mossaddegh was deposed, for however you want to frame it, was just in any way. But they did kind of treat him with a degree of reverence appropriate for his history with Iran and his position.
And also, obviously, considering his popularity as well.
Exactly. That was had a lot political. To do with it. Yeah, it certainly did. Because, executing someone like Mosaddegh would have been an extremely, extremely unpopular move.
Absolutely.
But it was then it was this event that really was, I think, kind of the beginning of the next series of events that ultimately, over the course of the next 25 or so years, led to the Shah's declining popularity. Now the Shah, after having been controlled by the CIA at this point, is becoming highly suspicious of political dissent, highly suspicious of any sort of communist threat, anything that might challenge his power. So this is when Savak is really, we talked about earlier, the secret police over the course of the next however many years, is really coming into play. Media is suppressed. Political speech is suppressed. Any form of dissent is suppressed. And then there was also a series of land reforms and other form of educational reforms that were really looked downly upon by, one, the religious clergy, the people who did not like the idea ever, even from when his father got rid of the mandatory hijab. One, we're always opposed to women being able to wear whatever they want, certainly being educated, being pulled out of these roles in their homes. And then several of these economic reforms were also riddled with corruption. A lot of nepotistic behavior by people who were in his, were either subordinate to him, people who would, take money or land for themselves. So there was certainly an issue with corruption during this time in Iran. Meanwhile, the religious groups are taking on a lot of they're kind of morphing their political ideologies and the way that they communicate. Their ideologies are still like back in like 1400 years ago, but they're becoming smarter about how to bring their ideology to the masses. So they really draw heavily on the teachings of Ali Shariati, who is a very populist Islamic scholar that believes in like this kind of socialist type form of Islam that is much more appealing to younger people and the masses, especially a lot of people who it's kind of like what you see in like this modern era of populism that we see today in the United States and other countries, really appealing to younger generations of people.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
sorry to interrupt your flow.
No, go ahead. I've been talking forever. So
one very important thing that happens here when the absence of Mosaddegh becomes a thing, and then people start growing further suspicious and disapproving of the Shah's methods. What happens now is that Khomeini, which is the great Satan, when he starts basically he was already in exile at this point, right?
Yeah, living in Paris.
Living in Paris. This is a guy that does not let go, right? This is a guy who, you want to look at the example of a human being obsessed with vengeance and retribution. Go look up Khomeini.
Yeah, now, he looks like a piece of shit too.
He really does. Yes, I mean, I don't want to insult a piece of shit, really, but yeah.
I have more reverence for a piece of shit than I do for hens.
Absolutely, and I don't think the surface of the moon looks that bad. So yeah. For anyone who gets that reference, fair play. But so anyway, so basically, now that you guys know mine and Parsa's stance on Khomeini. So this is an Islamic guy who's basically, he's in Paris, and then he's giving out all these little speeches and things, and then basically the Islamic clerics in Iran, all of their groups, they are strongly tied with Khomeini. And then all of a sudden you'll find that, just as Parsa put it, like appealing to the younger generation, all of Khomeini's little speeches start basically by ways of tapes, like bootleg tapes. They start going around, they start spreading. It was basically like a 70s version of something going viral, basically.
He had his own podcast in the 70s, basically, on tape.
Exactly that, yeah. And then all these tapes are going around, people are listening to it, and then he's trying to appeal to the people, saying that, these monarchs, they're very corrupt, they're this and that, and then we should.
They're Western puppets, which was the huge point, right? And that's where a lot of the, and that's rooted in what the CIA and the British did in Iran, specifically in 1953, that led to this series, like this kind of subsequent, like, political tyranny by the Shah, and then there was already opposition to foreign interests outside of Iran, and now you had a direct example of it that the religious groups like Khomeini were able to point to and be like, listen, like, look at how they've destroyed our country with the help of these outside Western influence. The Shah is nothing but a puppet king. He's a puppet for the Americans and a puppet for the British.
Which we should also point out that exactly at this time, whilst there is a lot of disapproval from the Iranian population. What we also have is the fact that Iran is actually one of the world's top 5 tourist locations. Okay, women walk around without any hijab. We've got casinos, we've got bars, we've got a very strong cinema culture. And that cinema part we're going to come to in just a moment. But, so Iran is it's one of them things, where people were unhappy with the Shah and they had the rights to be unhappy with him. However, things were perhaps not quite as bad as what they would realize would turn into if a revolution would happen. So let's should we talk about the cinema incident that then happened, because I think that was the tipping point, really. It was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, and it's a pretty horrifying incident in Iran's history. But this is at a time where now we're in late 1978, right? So the Shah's popularity. And one other thing I want to mention is before we get to that, one of the mistakes that the Shah had made, especially in the time of, economically, Iran, would have a good bit of people that were living in poverty. Years before, still in the 70s, the Shah, to celebrate the 2,500-year anniversary of, the Persian Empire, essentially, decides to have a very extravagant party at Persepolis, which is an ancient city, and it's in ruins. It was destroyed by Alexander the Great, but it was really the capital of the Persian Empire, located right outside of Shiraz. Incredible place. But he decides to have this party that costs tens of, maybe, I don't know, an insane amount of money, tens of millions of dollars. And he's going to invite all of the leaders of foreign countries and their delegations to this party. I think to this day, it's probably still, there's never in history been an event like this in any country ever, where you have basically the leader of every single country in existence, at this celebration of the 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire.
Maybe except Epstein's Island, but I guess that's a different thing.
But it's
we won't get into that.
That might have more, but
right, yeah.
But it was an absurd and frankly, in many ways, obscenely extravagant event. And this party, which cost so much money, while many Iranians were living in poverty and they were not themselves invited, right? It's foreigners who have come to Iran for this party. And it's Iran's money that is paying for this, was looked down upon and was extraordinarily unpopular and probably very tone deaf of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi at the time. So that party was a huge mistake and also contributed to the propaganda that the religious groups were able to use against him. So his popularity is now at this point at an all-time low. He's a Western puppet. He's using his money, Iran's money, for this is the propaganda that's coming out against him. He's using Iran's money for his own personal gain, for all these extravagant purposes. It's not going back to the people of Iran.
Which you can look at this from multiple aspects as well. I mean, this is how propaganda works. This is still the same in today's world. The mechanism of it is the same, is that what you're presenting might be relating to the truth in some ways.
Right.
What you're covering
it's about how it's fun.
Exactly. It's the perspective of the truth which you then try to portray, especially when you try to portray someone's intentions through your own lens. I think that's a very big part of what propaganda really is and how it works still to this day. And I think this was very much applicable. Now you can then try and get inside Mohammad Reza Shah's head and say, well, actually, he was trying to bring the attention to Iran. He was trying to basically present Iran in a better light, He was trying
to introduce Iran to the world, right? Which, maybe that view has some merit to it. I think I do think the choice was a mistake.
There's no question about that
absolutely
part.
Was,
for sure.
I can understand maybe there's the intentions behind it may have been good, but I think it was poor judgment, and certainly not received well by the people of Iran. And as the king, he should have known how it was perceived. And maybe not the wisest way to spend Iran's money at this time when his popularity is not in a good place. So this happens. Now we've gotten to late 1978. All forms of religious, you're having a lot of religious extremists starting to speak out against the Shah. These are people who are pretty powerful in Iran, especially popular or powerful and have a lot of influence in the bazaars and in the merchant area, which is where all the merchants and a lot of the trade is happening and business in Iran. In Abadan in Iran, which is I think pretty closely outside of a major religious city, there was this movie theater called the Cinema Rex Theater. And about 600 people were in the theater. The theater was barricaded and set on fire. So about 400 or so people were burned alive in the theater. And at this time, it was in history the deadliest terrorist act that's in like modern recorded history, right? Like this is the deadliest terrorist incident that's ever taken place in the world. Khomeini and his supporters and the religious clerics pointed and said that Savak, the Shah's secret police force, was responsible for this, that it was basically a direct order from the Shah, and he was, he killed these people, Savak killed these people. This was a complete lie and a complete fabrication. It was religious extremists, and they later found out it was religious extremists who had direct ties to clergy members who had close relationships with Khomeini, who barricaded the theater and murdered all of these people and burned them alive. But it was immediately used. So his own people, Khomeini's own people, murdered all of these people, these innocent people in this theater, and then immediately turned around and pointed to the Shah and said that they did it. At this point, the next day, I'm pretty sure, protests erupt all over the place in Iran. And now this is the beginning of the end for the Pahlavi dynasty. At this point, people are rising up. You have, look at people, no matter what that was said at this point. This is late 1978. So the revolution is really only like a few months away at this point. No matter what the Shah denying it doesn't matter. Like people didn't believe him. Once it was said by these religious groups, the damage had been done. Yeah. So the event that the Islamic Republic used to gain power was a massacre of Iranians, right? So they massacred hundreds of Iranians as basically that was their first mass killing. Not their only. They've done many mass killings since then, but that was the first mass killing by the Islamic Republic that they used to and weaponized and created propaganda around in order to gain control of the country. We have a series of events that happened after that, but I kind of view this as really the first crime against humanity that was committed by the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, and I think that that was
it wasn't a republic yet, but it's
the same motherfuckers behind it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. And then once this happened, then basically, long story short, I don't think we have to get into the details too much, but within a year of that, the Shah of Iran was exiled, and basically people and then Khomeini came in, replaced him, and there was a voting, which I thought was the biggest pile of shit I've ever seen. Was that they tried to do a voting, and you want to talk about mass formation psychosis. They did these polls where it was like, oh, so you people, you get the choice to vote for an Islamic Republic of Iran. And to people at that time, to them, that's like, oh, okay, so that's the only choice we have other than the monarchy that we've got. Never mind that, oh, well, hang on a second, maybe we can focus on democracy. No. This was at a time where people were so excited from the revolution that they had just won, because let's put it this way, there was a lot of intense fighting going on, especially at first, because a lot of the forces were basically shooting people on the streets, and there was a lot of violence and a lot of tensions that happened like that. And as usual, I think there were parts of the army that then decided to join the people, but then it was the police forces that were still against the people. There's a very interesting psychology as to that, that generally is something that happens. But anyway, basically, this is what happened. There was a lot of fights, but then the people won. The Shah escaped and fled Iran. Him and his family left, and then Khomeini basically takes over. Then they do this voting system, and this is the funny part. 97.5% of the country voted yes for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and many people subsequently also fled Iran at that point. So I think a very large proportion of the Iranian population outside of Iran, they come from that generation who basically fled just at the time of the revolution, and rightfully so. I think they
myself included. I'm a direct descendant of people who had fled. But there's a few things I want to touch on in this period, that in this year, kind of after the Shah leaves. There's a lot of factors that led to the Shah's leaving. President Jimmy Carter in the U.S. is extraordinarily unpopular among Iranians for a series of mistakes that he made, which we don't need to get into, but I think very valid reasons why he's unpopular among Iranians.
And you mean Iranians today, just to be
Iranians
clear.
today,
Yes,
right?
That's right.
A lot of people view Jimmy Carter as really turning his back on the Shah, not supporting him, and basically creating like the circumstances that in that immediate time period led to the Islamic Republic being able to take over the country. And so Iran at this time has no government, right? There's the military, but the military does not want to engage in a civil war. The military decides basically that they're going to hand over their guns to they're going to put down their weapons, and they basically hand over the country to Khomeini, right? And his supporters, realizing that at this point, a lot of the police had kind of already defected. People were getting to a point where you might have voted, quote unquote, for the Islamic Republic, but in this year, Iran is kind of in a state of anarchy. There's mass executions. Anyone who had any affiliation or any was part of the Shah's regime, or who was had any sympathies to the Shah, we're talking like mass executions taking place every morning. You would wake up. I wasn't alive back then, but from the account side, here your alarm clock in the morning was machine guns killing people, like mass executions. People would be lined up and they would be killed with machine gun fire. So anyone who wasn't aligned with this new Islamic revolutionary ideology was executed, and that went on for months and months and months. And what's still going on today.
It is. What's crazy about that is that one thing that they came down on very hard, like their priority at the very beginning, was to kill anyone who was in any way associated with Savak, the secret police that we mentioned. And there are accounts of them. Now, I don't know how they found the names of everyone. I presume they just sort of infiltrated.
People were turning on each other. I mean, family, your neighbors were turning on you. People who, maybe align themselves, people's family members, right? Yeah. Like if you had a family member who participated in parents didn't know if their children had been brainwashed by this ideology and were going to turn them in, right? Like you had families that were destroyed, all sorts of people, like neighbors reporting on each other. It's like the type of shit that happened in Nazi Germany, right? People that would report to the religious clerics, like anyone who might be a sympathizer. So there was this cleansing that was taking place by the regime. And also a lot of the people, especially the younger Iranians who were like the college students, again, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't really know what the ideology of Khomeini was when they were deciding on what was the new. They thought, oh, we'll be able to build a republic. The religious groups will have their representatives, and we'll be able to like have this open dialogue. That they had never experienced anything like this before, right? So like you're in this very this major period of uncertainty among a group of people who had never actually practiced civil society in real life, because they never had the opportunity to do so. And even, like as I said earlier, vet the intentions of other people that were involved in the revolution. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Khomeini himself. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think this is actually a very important point. And then basically, if you want to dissect the psychology of it, I'm pretty sure a lot of it also came down to the fact that people just desperately wanted to be on the right team, because by the right team, meaning that they were on the side of the Islamic Republic, that they weren't gonna be attacked or anything, because a lot of people
survival
also participated. Part of it was survival. Part of it was this sort of pride that came from actually having participated in the revolution, and then sort of this mass buying of the wholesale ideology of the Islamic Republic, where like maybe they just wanted better finances or economics. That's why they were a part of the revolution. But now they have to wholesale buy the idea that, oh yeah, women have to wear hijab, anyone who was with the Shah needs to be executed, and everyone has to be a Muslim, everyone has to do their prayers, and then the whole country has to turn in that direction. Now the whole Middle East needs to have that revolution. And that's what I mean by the wholesale ideology of the Islamic Republic, that basically then everyone had to buy on. And if you question any of that, then you were on the wrong side. You were on the wrong side of the team. And this is exactly, just as a lesson for everyone listening to this, this is why I am always extremely adamant on people not throwing away the idea of free speech by buying into censorship just because they don't agree with certain people, because this is exactly what it leads to, and this is a dangerous thing. We don't want that in the Western world and in these societies, because this is what it becomes, is that once you embrace that censorship, once you have one group dominating everyone else, then that means that you have to wholesale buy into all of their ideology. You question any of it, then that means you're against the mob, and that means that you can be in danger. Now, it doesn't mean that, let's say, you're gonna be fucking shot or executed for that, but these are the places that these sort of ideological power struggles can lead down. So this is just a little piece of friendly advice to all of our Western friends, that to embrace more of a free speech absolutist approach. So that's just my take on that, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of free speech. There are, people have debates all the time over what are the limits of free speech, and what can you, what shouldn't or should be allowed. And I think there's probably merit to different arguments. I think the Islamic Republic is a perfect example of why free speech is critically important. And right now we have people that are literally dying for it in Iran today, right? Like they're risking everything
exactly
for it. And I mean, we like to think we would have that the level of bravery that those people who are dying for it in Iran today would have. I can say with certainty that you have that level of bravery, because I know what you did in Iran when you were playing your music, and the amount of courage that it takes to do something like that. And I do want to talk about that a little bit later. I like to think that I would have that same level of bravery. I don't know. I haven't had to be in that position, but I'm trying to do as much as I can from the place that I'm at least.
I appreciate that, man. I don't think it's a competition, because a lot of times, even though you make a very good point, but I think a lot of times I look at the guys who are in Iran fighting and going head on head with the police, and I think, I'm not sure if I'm that. I mean, I would like to think that if I was still there, this is what I would be doing, but also, yes, I risked my life for playing black metal, and it's a crazy thing. I still, I do wonder sometimes, I question myself. I'm like, with with who I am now, still take that kind of risk compared to when I was like 15 years old. But the answer, like after a little bit of hesitation, is always yes, because I know what it is that I'm fighting for. If anything, I understand the value of freedom better now than I did back then. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's actually that element to it as well. But I think the important thing is not, oh, who's the bravest, like who's the, it's not like a pissing contest. It's like, oh, who can do the craziest thing that's the bravest of them all. Don't get me wrong, I did a lot of very crazy things, including like desiccating one praying site, which we can get into later, but and multiple other things, like I one time kicked a bottle of piss at a Quran teacher in high school, and I almost got really fucked up because of that. I played Marduk's Baptism by Fire inside an Islamic praying room when I was 15. I told the story on the previous podcast to this one, which is
I don't think I heard that one. I'll have to go back and listen to that. That sounds awesome.
So I hold my hands up. Yeah, I've done a lot of crazy shit. But the point, what I'm trying to say is, it's not about a competition of that, and a lot of things that I said are admittedly quite juvenile, but they prove a point. And I think the point is that we all take our own responsibility in fighting for what's valuable to us, in fighting for what really is the thing that we should all be fighting for, which is freedom, So like you said, you kind of pointed to this earlier, rather than pushing it off to the side saying, oh, it's the fault of the Islamic Republic, oh, it's the fault of the Pahlavis, oh, it's the fault of the West. No, we take responsibility for what Iran is in today's world. And when we do the same principle, you can apply that to your own life. You don't just have to be an Iranian person to follow that principle. But I think that's the idea, is taking responsibility for how things are within yourself, taking ownership. You know what I'm saying? I think that's the main important takeaway from that.
Yeah, I think a part of that is going to require, especially for a lot of Iranians who have a lot of pride. Iranians maybe sometimes are over prideful, but it's going to require putting a lot of ego and pride aside. People who have, gone and Iranians today, and even those of us who weren't born in Iran or weren't born when the revolution took place, people who don't know what it was like before, and then those people who do know what it was like before, like everyone is going to have to put aside like a degree of their own ego and pride and be very open to because when I think about the Iran that we want, it's not, I don't want to go back to pre-Islamic revolution Iran. I want to build something better than that, right? Like I want to see Iran that was better than it ever was, an Iran that was, doesn't certainly not the Iran that we have today. Like we have to we went back 1400 years. Now we got to come back like 1500 years.
Very true. Right? Yes. That's right.
But something that is better than all of that. And that's going to require a massive undertaking, building things like, civil societies, having forums and venues where people can put aside their own egos and test each other's ideologies and their belief without like a degree of shame, because that's another thing that we struggle with, I think, is a lot of Iranians, because they have been traumatized so much by what the Islamic Republic has done. I think the response by a lot of Iranians has been to entrench themselves further in what convictions they held onto and their beliefs. And so Iranians in many respects are very, and there's a lot of mistrust, and I understand the reasons for it. Even outside of Iran, like you might have a neighbor that shows up and all of a sudden from Iran with a bunch of money, and you're like, is this person like affiliated with the regime? Like, are they here to like report on people? We know of people who in Canada, for example, were money launderers for the regime and are spying on the activities of other Iranians. and reporting back. So like I understand the reasons for the mistrust, but Iranians are certainly have a long way to go in how deeply, like in terms of growing out of this like deep entrenchment into their current beliefs, and how fixated they are that their one way of doing something is right. Like for me, like I don't live in Iran, so like I don't know, like I don't necessarily like. I try not to assume I know what's best for Iran. I do know that whatever the outcome is, once the Islamic Republic falls, which I do think will happen, I do think that is inevitable. I don't know how long it will take, but what's important to me is that the Iranian people are the decision makers of their own fate. And a lot of people outside of Iran have decided that they already know what they want without consulting the Iranian people, right? Like,
no, I understand what you're saying about that. I think that's a very important point. I think I do still want to sort of complete the circle around the history part of this, but
yeah, let's do it.
You make a very valid point in that a lot of Iranians are sort of made up their minds. Well, what's also crazy about it is that everyone is so fucking divided in what they actually want, and this includes all the Iranians. But the thing that we all have in common is that we don't want the Islamic Republic.
Exactly.
But at
right.
the same time, you have many people who want, they for example, they want the monarchy back in place. You've got people who want there to be some kind of a reform, which we know is not an option. And then you've got other people, like there's all these different elements to it, and we also have to acknowledge that a lot of Iranians, not everyone obviously, but a big portion of them, I would say, hold very strong racist ideology as well. So a lot of them would want that to be then implemented into the politics of the country, saying like, oh, fuck anyone coming over from Afghanistan, these guys are just coming over here, and like that whole thing that
we have our shortcomings, just like any other group of people, for sure. And
I think
all that. Sorry, go ahead.
The point I was just going to make was that, to your point, actually, I wanted to really agree with you on the fact that you said that because of the degree of trauma that we've had to deal with because of the Islamic Republic and their actions, which have been very extreme, and they took the, they did the very smart thing of learning everything from the mistakes of the Pahlavi dynasty and not repeating those things, and not taking things lighthearted. And they've been extremely strict and as extreme as they could have been, and that's the reason why they are still in power. And
they executed 30,000 people in 1988 in one sweep, accusing them all of being part of the Mosaddegh, the MEK, which is a awful fucking terrorist organization that has no place in Iran. They're like they're another group of Islamic fascists, the fascists that hate the Islamic Republic, but also don't support the people and want to create their own form. So they accuse, many of which were MEK members that were assassinated, not to justify mass executions and mass sentencing. That's wrong no matter who it is. But many of whom were not, and several of whom included women and children and family members. So like, this is the level of their brutality, right? And this was in one mass sentence, basically, where they said all 30,000 of you are guilty and you're all going to be executed.
And I'm sure you're following up the case in Sweden at the moment, right?
I haven't been following it too closely, but I've saw that it's been filed.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's with Mr. Hamid Nouri, I believe. I think that's for anyone who's interested. I recommend checking out the court cases for that one, especially because of obviously this is a fucking criminal who's just been caught out of nowhere because he was trying to sort of hide his identity, and just because of one text on his phone, basically they identified the guy, and this is going all the way back to 80s when that whole thing happened. So yeah, this is just a little anecdote. People can go look this up for themselves because we still have a lot to cover here. So I think that what we can do is we can have a quick break here, and then we'll come back to discuss the post-Islamic Revolution part of our history, and then bring it to the current day and the shit that we're basically dealing with at the moment. But I think people have a pretty good idea at the moment. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Okay, cool. So we're back again. So I think a good point to sort of continue things in regards to the Islamic Republic is perhaps the political structure of how it even works. Because on one hand, you've got a president, but then behind him, you have got the supreme leader. Now, we've only had 2 supreme leaders so far, which this always even confused me as a child. They have very similar surnames, okay? And it's a rare surname, too. So, first off, you've got Khomeini, who's the leader of the Islamic Revolution, the biggest piece of shit in the history of humankind, or amongst them anyway. And then you've got the, how shall I say, the gentleman in place now, Khamenei, who has been around, he's the successor to Khomeini, and I don't know if you've actually watched this, but have you seen the meeting where he originally got appointed to be the supreme leader?
I actually haven't. No.
It's very interesting because it's Rafsanjani who's he's kind of pushing for it, saying that, you know, and then they do this like sort of weird voting thing, and then Khamenei keeps saying how, oh, of course, I don't want to be in this position. This position is just not suitable for me. You know, when we're doing Taarruf as Iranians, like he's doing Taarruf over the position of the supreme leader. He's like, no, I shouldn't be having this. This is just not appropriate for me at all. And then everyone does a vote, and they choose him to be the supreme leader, and he starts crying.
Not the people. The people do not vote.
Not the people. Yeah. No, the Muslim clerics all sat in that room deciding between themselves. But it's very interesting because he then breaks down crying, and it's a very legitimate cry. I don't know if it's a cry of, oh shit, what I've gotten myself into, or fuck yes, I did it. You know, like it's very hard to read that one. I recommend you to check it out, or to anyone else, just from a pure human psychology. It's such a interesting event to sort of analyze, knowing what we know, and you know, it's
always safe with them. It's always safe with them to assume the worst of intentions.
I think so. Yeah, that's probably safe to say that. So let's sort of break down the political structure of it, but also just so people are aware. Okay, so the revolution happens, and then now you've got this new entity, which is basically executing everyone in his fucking presence. And a big part of that history is that almost immediately after the Islamic Revolution, Iran and Iraq get into a conflict. And a big part of this is also the fact that Khomeini, as I mentioned earlier, he's got vengeance for Saddam Hussein, because when Khomeini was in Iraq, Saddam basically exiled Khomeini out of there in sort of collaboration with the Shah of Iran, because he didn't think that this random fucking Muslim cleric was going to go and take over Iran, basically, you know.
Yeah, so Khomeini implements this, the Islamic Revolution to him was not intended to be contained within Iran. So, you know, it mentioned that the revolution was not done solely by Islamic fundamentalists or extremists. There were a lot of people who were not religious that participated in it, who thought that they would be able to implement some sort of, you know, republic of some kind that respected, you know, political discourse. Khomeini himself later said publicly that he lied about all of the things that he promised people, and he said that Islam permits lying in a time of war. So he justified his lies. You know, he basically admitted publicly to tricking the Iranian people, and all those people who joined in on the revolution started realizing that the Islamic religion, like fundamentalists and extremists, were now they've gotten rid of the Shah. Now they're going to start eating their own, in terms of people who, I say their own, but what I mean is like the revolution, people who participated in the revolution alongside them. Yeah. So they start turning their sights on other revolutionaries who weren't religious, and start executing these people themselves. So it's not just, Iran doesn't just see an exodus of, you know, former royalists or monarchists, people who are loyal to the Shah. They see an exodus of people who have any sort of difference with the Islamic Republic, even those who participate in the revolution. So Iran has one of the worst cases, if not the worst case, of brain drain in history, because anyone who has, any sort of education, who isn't religious leaning, some of the smartest people that Iran has ever produced have all left the country. So you're left, crippled by this form of religious fanaticism that has taken over in the form of a theocracy, but also in terms of the mental capabilities of the country, and the smartest people have now left. And
this is very true. Obviously, I'm sat here, so that
exactly. The best black metal that Iran has ever produced is now happening outside of Iran. So with Trivax. So there you go. Perfect example.
There we go.
But so his revolution, his Islamic revolution, was intended is not an Iranian revolution. It is an Islamic revolution, meaning he wanted this revolution. He wanted to create basically a caliphate that spanned all over the region, all over. It was a revolution of the entire Muslim world. Saddam Hussein, who's a member of the Ba'athist Party, which is a socialist, secular party, which is still he's a tyrant. He's a dictator. One of the worst people. He's in hell right alongside of Khomeini right now. And he was extremely concerned, so were the other Gulf states, that the Islamic revolution in Iran would be exported to other parts of the Middle East. So they were concerned about uprisings in their own country. They had this kind of pan-Arab socialist type of ideology. So he is now viewing Khomeini and the Islamic Republic as a direct threat to their stability. Meanwhile, the United States, the UK, they are also, Iran has now become the boogeyman of the world, rightfully so, to be honest. They've taken hostages. You had the hostage crisis, which we don't need to get into because everyone knows about that. It's been covered so much, so extensively. But Saddam Hussein now is dealing with threats of religious threats in his own country. About 20 members of the Ba'athist Party were actually assassinated by Shiite extremists, who he was heavily opposed to the Shiite people in his own country. 20 members of the Ba'athist Party were assassinated by Shiite extremists in his own country, and almost included the assassination of the prime minister of Iraq at the time. So, and it's very reasonable to suspect that these Shiite extremists had direct links to Khomeini. So, from his perspective, Iran is the initial aggressor of the Iran-Iraq war by having these ties and starting this kind of trying to export its revolution to the other countries in the Middle East. So he responded to this act pretty quickly, deciding that he was going to invade Iran. He thought that he would be able to take over the country relatively easily.
Because he was told by his close intel that, if you do this, they'll turn over to you quickly, because they're not happy or whatever, which we should say, by the way, that's exactly what happened with Putin. He was told by his intel that if he invaded Ukraine, that soon turn to him, so you can always, this is a very interesting dynamic. Now you can question that, why this information will be passed on, if this is genuine information. I think in the case of Saddam, we can very easily say that due to just how trigger happy he was, I think that a lot of it could just be down to the fact that people were afraid. People were constantly trying to appeal to him. I mean, he had his own magician who would basically do basic magic tricks, and Saddam kept this guy around just because he was like, oh, wow, this is really fun, and that's the kind of a
major egomaniac, for sure.
Insane, absolutely insane. Right. Yeah.
And he also, it didn't help that Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were nudging him along and saying, hey, if you go to war with Iran, we'll pay for it, right? We'll give you all the money that you need in order to invade them. And he basically got a blank check. And then, he was also getting funded actually Iran also had support from, you had people that were funding both sides of the war.
Yeah, but this was. We should also say that the funding from both sides didn't always happen
at the same time.
This was something, because we have to say that the Iran and Iraq War was, and this is actually a very relevant topic of discussion as to just the history of Islamic Republic alone, because part of the reason why they are in that situation, a lot of it does lie down on the Iran-Iraq War. Because one thing that I think is very important, that I feel like this never gets mentioned enough, but when you are in the situation of a revolution, because you have to think as well, it's not like Iran were not provoking Iraq in certain ways. In fact, really, other than those acts that you mentioned, Iran did also conduct some airstrikes before the actual invasion of Iraq.
I think there were a couple skirmishes in like certain disputed borders, because there was land disputes, right? Like
that's right.
The first point of the invasion by Iraq was to take over land that was actually promised to them in a treaty that the Islamic Republic, like years before, the treaty was never consummated, but that the Islamic Republic basically went back on, and that was parts of the country that were actually Arab Iranians, right? That were living in those areas. So he thought that he would not face any sort of resistance in order to take on these. And initially he didn't, right? He was actually able to take control or occupy these areas with a relative amount of ease, thinking,
and by you mean Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein, right? And he's thinking this is a brand new government. They don't have their shit together. They're not going to be able to mount any sort of meaningful defense. And he did have some successes in encroaching on these parts of the Iranian lands.
And that was in Khorramshahr, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah,
or was it Khuzestan and Khorramshahr, and like the region, like parts of.
That's right. Yeah. I'm just thinking of Hussein family there, but let's not throw too many names out there and confuse people.
But what he didn't, and he also, given the weakness of it, he thought that he would make the Islamic Republic look really weak in the eyes of his own people, and the people would basically just he would be able to invade and maybe be some form of salvation of some kind, that people would just look at the Islamic Republic as like an embarrassment because of their defeats,
so that they wouldn't embrace the ideas of Islamic Republic, which is what Khomeini wanted.
That strategy failed very drastically. What the people of Iran did instead was they did not turn their sights on their own government. They looked at Saddam Hussein as a foreign invader, and they mounted a very formidable defense. The people of Iran basically now, and this arguably emboldened and strengthened the regime in many ways, because
absolutely
they were able to point directly to Saddam Hussein and be like, we are not your enemy. This is your enemy. And the people of Iran, and which is, I mean, when you're defending like the territorial integrity of your country, like it's a pretty easy sell, right? Like
it's almost like your government is, like you want to look at it like this. Let's say you live in America, and you realize that your government is moving towards a totalitarian direction. People start waking up to it, and people.
But now I have Russia, on our shores.
Yeah, or even better, you get a made-up alien invasion using advanced technology, and then that's even more interesting. And then everyone is like, "Hey guys, unite together, stay the fuck in your homes, and then let us control you whilst we fight the boogeyman." That's basically. That played right into the hand of the Islamic Republic, basically. And
meanwhile, they are also using this to purge more political opponents within Iran, right? So they're one. The Islamic Republic has an immediate need to get more organized, more further weaponized. Finding, they're dealing with economic embargoes from the West, because they're not, like as we said earlier, they are the boogeyman. So they have to go find ways to get armed. They do have the existing Air Force of Iran, which was quite powerful and was built during the Shah's time, all American-made aircrafts. So they're pretty advanced in terms of the actual armaments and technology they have.
And Saddam's army were absolute fucking idiots. Like the way
he did. He had a lot of yes men in terms of
Yeah.
his generals, people who were not very competent. I think
because they were afraid of being shot.
Yeah, exactly. And they got, I think, an air force. They tried to mount a significant number of aerial attacks against the Iranian Air Force in an attempt to destroy it, but didn't realize how heavily armored the Iranian Air Force was. So they barely like made a dent in it and missed all the, like basically were not successful at all.
Yeah.
And now the people of Iran are very focused on defending Iran instead of dealing with, the fact that you have this extremist government. They've turned around, done a 180, and looking straight at Saddam Hussein, being like, you're going to try to take over Iran, like over my dead fucking body. Like,
but that exactly what that does is that unifies the people with the Islamic Republic. Now, if you want to talk about the results of the war, if we want to say it very summarized, because I do want to get into the present day, basically what happened was that nothing happened. So it was near 8 years of war. None of the borders really changed.
Extremely traumatizing war, right? Like use of chemical weapons, human wave attacks by the Iranian army. Literally would send. We're going back to like World War I when you had human waves. Like Iranian military was doing this, sending just massive waves of human, including children, through minefields. So this actually fed into the propaganda, right? Creating this idea of martyrdom in the Iran-Iraq war to praise these people as heroes. So like the Islamic Republic was able to create these heroes out of the war and use that as part of their propaganda messaging. And they would literally send unarmed children through these minefields in order to clear them. So sending kids without any guns in their hands to just walk through a minefield to clear it. They're walking with the intention of dying, right? And
we should also, a very important thing to add here is that, so this is not just in defense. No, these are minefields. So Iraq wouldn't be planting giant minefields inside of Iran. No. So basically, a long story short, what happened at the beginning was that after Iraq's invasion, Iran basically took back the space, but then Iran, with the supreme leader's supreme greed, then decide to actually invade Iraq. And then these kids and everyone is under the impression, we're going to take back Karbala. This belongs to Imam Hussein, all that shit.
Right.
So they
went on the offensive, and now Iraq is on the defensive with Iran invading in retaliation.
Exactly. And this is where they were using a lot of those human waves, where they're basically sending children to run through the minefields, but this was a part of an invasion that then Iran did on Iraq as a retaliation. So that's even more fucked up. Like if you're trying to defend your country and that's what you're doing, it's one thing. When you're trying to invade another country and then you're sending children to get blown up to pieces just to make room for the rest of your infantry to go through, that tells you, I think, the mindset of the Islamic Republic, how much human life actually means to them,
they were so, and I think this is a good segue into the ideology of the Islamic Republic. They understand one thing, and it's violence and death. They worship death, right? So we talked earlier about our traditions and our customs. Nimruz, for example. Nimruz is a celebration of life. We have lots of symbolism, and this is, I think, who Iranians truly are, right? We celebrate life. We value its rebirth, like the concepts of rebirth, the coming of spring. The Islamic, and we have a lot of colors in our culture, right? If you look at images of Iran before the Islamic Revolution, my uncle actually doesn't even like calling it the Islamic Revolution. He calls it the collapse. That he doesn't use this term revolution because he thinks of it as just a collapse of Iran. But they
it's like we got swallowed by a black hole of ideology.
Exactly. But if you look, you look at Iran back then, the way you would look at people in the streets, there's so much color, and some of that is still there. But when you look at images of Iran today, or even when you're looking at it now, it's devoid of color. People wear black, right? Cars, black, gray, white. The color of Iran has been stripped in many ways, right? These people are death worshippers, and the only thing they understand is violence and death. And I think the Iran-Iraq war provides perfect examples how they celebrate literal children walking into their death, and that's what they value and praise, because these people are dying for their God. They've completely submitted, to God, and given up any sort of free will, and they do this, and that's what's worthy of celebration and praise.
And also the fact that it's the famous quote from Khomeini during the war where he said, if you shoot them, you'll go to heaven. If they shoot you, you'll go to heaven. You've got nothing to lose. Off to war.
Exactly. So I mean, this is who they are, right? It's they don't, in Iran today, women, for example, and in dancing and singing is not permitted in public. We have people like to talk about like, oh, but Iran is so modern, like women, there's more women in college than there are men. I'm just like, okay, so fucking what?
That demographic means absolutely fucking nothing. Not when those same women aren't even allowed to ride bicycles in public. They can't attend football stadiums. They can't leave the country without the consent of a husband or at least a father. It's right. Totally fucking bizarre, and if they're caught without their hijab, you will find them in a situation like Mahsa Amini last year. That was only just over a year ago, and it's not like she was the only person that happened to. I'm glad that it got the coverage it did, but also this has been going on for fucking years. How many people have we known who've been subject to this kind of bullshit and this brutality that's all ideologically driven? And it comes back to the idea of Islam, and hence why the Islamic Republic it's an evil combination.
Yeah, and Iran is now become prone to more than just Islamic fanaticism. You're also talking about mafias and mobsters who are in position of power, who aren't necessarily religious, but they've created this environment where criminals are permitted to thrive and be in positions of power. So this is another good example. You mentioned this is not the only. Mahsa Amini is certainly not the first woman who has suffered in this way. One, they're talking more about who they are. Another thing that we should acknowledge is her Kurdish identity. She is a member. She's a Kurdish woman. Kurdish people are extremely discriminated against in Iran under the kind of iron fist of the Islamic Republic. Kurdish names are you're not allowed to name your children Kurdish names. So Mahsa is not the name that her family refers to her as. Mahsa is the name that she was forced to take on, but as part of on her legal documents on her birth certificate, because her real name that her family refers her to, Gina, is not is a Kurdish name. So she can't legally take on that name. So there's a degree of ethnic racism that's inherent in the Islamic Republic. Another example, just this past Friday was the anniversary of Bloody Friday in Zahedan, which is a Baluch in Sistan and Baluchistan. Baluchistan is a region in Iran that is occupied. I don't want to use the word occupied. This is their home. The people who live in it are Baluchi people, another ethnic minority who happen to be from they're Sunni Islam. They're Sunnis primarily. The Bloody Friday was an event that happened a year ago on Friday, pretty soon after Gina's killing, where about 100 Baluch people many of whom had just come out of prayer, were attacked by snipers that were Islamic Republic snipers that were part of the Revolutionary Guard, who just opened fire on these people, killing about 100 people. Zahedan and the whole Baluchistan is stripped and devoid of infrastructure, of medical. The Islamic Republic deliberately does not bring development to these parts of Iran. Access to water is limited. They don't have
like
good
a form
hospitals.
of ethnic cleansing, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've engaged in many forms of ethnic cleansing all over Iran and anywhere where they have non-Persian ethnic populations.
And we should also add that the people that they slaughtered were just average civilians.
These were civilians, and so they were not just protesting Gina's killing. So they were outside of, I think, I want to say a police station, because they were about a week before, in the few days before Gina was killed, there was a woman in Baluchistan who, not a woman, a 15-year-old girl who had been sexually assaulted or raped. When she went to the police, which is the Islamic Republic's police, the police said, okay, we need to inspect your body and to look at the signs of your rape. When they were inspecting the body, the chief of police raped her. So a rape victim coming to the police to report the rape is then raped by the police when they're inspecting her. So the people who were protesting on Bloody Friday who were killed were also protesting Gina's death, and also this 15-year-old girl who had been raped. And I unfortunately I cannot remember if that 15-year-old girl was killed or not. I just can't remember the specific details. But
more than likely will have been, because one thing that that these cunts do is that anyone who's in any kind of a custodial situation, they might not get killed in prison, but then they give them poison just before they release them. So a lot of people fall into coma and die 2-3 days after they get released from prison.
Yeah, so these people who are in prison are subject, and this is all over Iran, subject to extreme forms of torture. Many people who have come out of these prisons have later committed suicide because of the trauma that they've faced. Men included are subject to rape by the prison guards, and they are sexually assaulted and abused by the guards in the prison and tortured. You have all sorts of forced confessions. I have a personal, and one of the things they do is, if they decide to execute the prisoners, after they go on trial, these are kangaroo courts, sham trials, usually people who have participated in protests. The trials last about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Little evidence there. The judge and the prosecutor are often the same person. We actually talked about the Cinema Rex massacre earlier. So once the Islamic Republic came into power, they had done an investigation into the Cinema Rex massacre. This is the Shah has been kicked out. They did an investigation. They appointed the son-in-law of one of the clerics who had ties to the extremists who set the theater on fire as both the prosecutor and investigating the incident and the judge. Right? So people who had ties to the event were the people who were then charged with investigating it. So it's similar things like this that still happen to this day, where people do not have any form of due process. They are, given bullshit trials with no evidence against them. Sometimes they will even, they'll fabricate all sorts of charges against you, and then they get sentenced to death after like a 10-minute trial. And then later, if they actually get a trial, some of these people just go missing, meaning that they've been killed and put in some unmarked mass graves somewhere where no one knows, and just basically been disappeared.
Basically what happened to Nika as well.
Exactly. She was a young, beautiful girl who basically disappeared and has become
she was
one of the symbols of the women life freedom movement today, along with
17-year-old
Gina.
girl who I think she had disappeared, and then they found her remains, and then they found all kinds of
Yeah, and of course, there's no investigations of any kind. And they even take it a step further. Is if you are, I'm going to use this word in quotes, one of the lucky families that gets to know what happened to your family member who was killed, they will often charge, if, for example, if they hung you or if they killed you by firing squad, they will charge the families for the bullets and rope that was used to kill the family member. Right.
Do that.
So they actually make you pay for the tool, like the family member of the person who was executed. They make them pay for the tools that were used to kill their family member, and then they will make you sign false statements saying that your family member died of natural causes, and that you can never talk about it. So of course,
it's natural causes when they've got bruises all over the body, when they got poison in their veins, and then their genitals are just absolutely damaged from the rape.
Exactly. Gina, for example, they still say they were just at the Ebrahim Raisi, the piece of shit president of the Islamic Republic, was just at the UN a couple weeks ago, still denying that Mahsa Jina Amini was killed, that she died of natural like heart conditions or something like that. And they're still denying it.
Just 1 second here. Like, okay, let's just for one hypothetical second, let's play the devil's advocate. Okay, she died of natural causes. How about the fucking hundreds of thousands of others who you motherfuckers absolutely slaughtered? Many of them over nothing. Literally over nothing, and this goes all the way back to someone who was a fucking secretary of Savak, who was just like a normal blue-collar worker that they fucking slaughtered and hung on the streets, all the way up until now, where some kids, like a young girl, who just put up a harmless video online on Instagram, and then you raided her home and you fucking killed her. Or like that other girl who they just like threw off of a building in front of her family just like a week or two ago. Like, how the fuck do you justify that? Listen, you cannot listen to this, and I urge people to do their own due diligence, but you cannot, in good conscience, deny the fact that the Islamic Republic are anything but murdering, fucking blood-hungry parasites on this planet.
Yeah, they're this will be a good segue into the discussion about reform. But one personal story I wanted to share is
by all means,
a family friend. So in Iran, for people who don't know, there's a militia group called the Basij. They are usually on motorcycles. They wear these stupid fucking headbands, and they have batons and stuff like that. And they're just gangs that basically, like, backed by the military, affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. They're enforcers. They're often the ones that are used to crack down on protesters, but they also just exist in your, like, kind of they're like on the corners and stuff like that. So you're constantly aware of their presence. So this was many, many years ago. We had a family friend who one day was just driving around, like, home. His car gets surrounded by Basij on motorcycles, and they start beating his windows and start breaking all of his windows, and and then they just drive off, right? So they're there just to have a constant source of intimidation. We have another family friend who was arrested for whatever reason. This was many, many years ago. It's actually a family member of a family friend of ours that's in Iran. A male member of the family basically was taken and was imprisoned for whatever bullshit reason. They killed him in prison. They removed his eyes. I don't know if they probably did this while he was still alive, and they basically told the family that the only way you're going to be able to recover his body, if you want to hold a funeral, right? Which is actually a right denied to many Iranians, especially Kurds and Baluch people. They prevent people from being able to even go visit grave sites. They block off the cemetery. But if you want to recover his body, you have to come in and sign a statement saying that your son died of natural causes. And so they desperately want to recover his body, right? So they'll go in and they have no choice, right? If they want to have any sort of, respectful funeral procession, they go in, see that his eyes have been removed. He's been subject to severe forms of torture, and are still being forced to sign these statements saying that it was completely natural. Nothing happened to him. So, I mean, I think one of the reasons, aside from, it's important to talk about these incidents, but I think there in 2009 we had what was the Green Movement in Iran, which was a reformist movement. I think many people.
I was there.
Many people were inspired by it. I think a lot of I was inspired by it. I thought maybe Iran. This was millions of people in the street. You had even people who now let's talk about we're talking about the political system of the way the regime works. We have a president, they have the supreme leader who's appointed by religious clerics. You have a president that is quote unquote elected, but he is approved. The only way you can run for election in Iran, especially as president, is if you are approved by the Guardian Council. So meaning you have to be a part of the clergy to run for president. So every single candidate in Iran who runs for president is part of the regime. Every single one. You cannot be not part of the regime and run for president. So you have to go through this.
Khatami was a reform guy. I actually saw him in person too,
Yeah.
Yeah. Like this was years ago, but I was like literally just like maybe 4 or 5 foot away from him in Imam Khomeini airport. He walked past us with like 2 security guards. And I never shared this publicly, but it was interesting being, he has a very large head.
He does. He looks like he has a big head.
Yeah. My dad saw that, and then he was like, I was like, Dad, he's got a very large head.
Everything looks bigger when you got this stupid fucking thing on your head. So
and then for sure. But I think that's the idea, is that reform's not really an option, because I'll make a very interesting example. During the years of the Green Movement, thankfully I didn't find myself in a situation where I had to flee Iran at that time, but I don't think it was too long after when I will have left. But I experienced all of it. I experienced where like family members of mine received fucking mustard gas just from being on the street and shit like that, because they were using all kinds of force against the protesters. There was the extremely grim killing of Neda Agha Sultan, which is like, that breaks my heart. It's the worst thing. Like when I've watched that video, and it's a video that haunts me. And if anyone's got the stomach, you can go watch it. But basically, she was like walking back from like a music academy, or like from seeing her music teacher or something like that, walking on the street, and they'd seen her in the protest before, and then boom, some fucking coward behind a sniper just shoots this innocent woman in the chest, and she dies in front of her father and a group of people surrounding her. The video's there. And she obviously made it big symbol, and her memory lives on. But this is the kind of things that they were doing. But
they just did something like that in this past year too with Kian Pirfalak. He was a 9-year-old boy, sitting in a car, and this is the one that has haunted me. I could not sleep for a month. This one definitely had a huge impact on me personally. I was having nightmares, because you see like the images coming out of Iran, videos, there was pictures of Kian Falak's body that were being circulated, which were extraordinarily difficult to look at.
I can't do that.
He was a 9-year-old.
Think about it.
Yeah, I mean, he was a 9-year-old boy just sitting in a car with his dad in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a protest happening, around the area. They were not participating in the protest. The security forces came up to the car and just started shooting in it point blank. And they just walked up to the car and just started shooting into this car. And they killed Kian Falak. His dad was in the car, went into a coma for months, unaware until he woke up, and he's been paralyzed from the waist down. He woke up a couple months later and then learned that his son was killed. And on the anniversary of Kian Falak, sorry, not on the anniversary. Kian Falak's birthday was a couple months ago. I want to say, I think it was July. I think it was in July. His family wanted to go to the gravesite to celebrate his birthday. His cousin was murdered by the security forces on the way to the cemetery. So that same day, a picture of Kian Falak's. So this was actually his mother's cousin. So I think his second cousin, something like that, cousin removed. That same day, you saw a picture of his mother at the gravesite, just with this stone cold look on her face. She's lost her son. Her cousin was just killed that same day. I will be upfront. I had a breakdown on that day. That was a very difficult day for me when I couldn't fucking believe it. And this was after now like however many months, 9 months of just these images of your compatriots and other Iranians, people who are just like you, being murdered and killed, and you're just taking it on all in. And for me, I had this view as like, I have to look at it. Like I'm like, the least I can do is look at it. I can't ignore it. I can't close myself off to it. And that just all came. So you just like bury it, like you bury the pain of seeing all these images, and it all caught up to me on that day. And that was a really, really tough day where I was just like in a bad place. I had to kind of remove myself for a couple weeks just to take a step back and really think about, like, take some time for my own mental health after how much, I had been traveling and putting into all of this. Fortunately, my wife was there for me and extraordinarily supportive, and really kind of helped me get through it. And we took a week where we went somewhere with no Wi-Fi, no cell reception, and just like basically like we're in nature for like a week to really kind of take a step back and kind of recharge and reset. But these are the people that, we talking about 2009, which was that reformist movement. There was back then a little bit of hope that maybe the regime could be changed a little bit from within.
Well, actually, to that point,
right?
First of all, man, that's absolute. It's horrifying and it's heartbreaking, and I don't think you don't have to be another Iranian person to hear that story and not have your heart broken to a million pieces, because we're human. When you're aware of the cruelty that's taking place, we're emotional sponges. We understand. You carry the pain because it's too much. It's the fact that as a collective the pain is already too much for us to carry. It just, I think, says a lot about the experience of Iranian people with the Islamic Republic. But what I will also say is, and this is not to take away from the other shit that happens in the world, of course, there's plenty of other stuff. There's like slavery in Congo, like there's never been a history of slavery. And
there's slavery in Qatar when they were building the facilities for the World Cup.
Exactly.
Next door.
There's plenty of shit, but this is like, there's no better saying, but this one hits home for us. But since you started going back to the topic of the reform, this is the story that I wanted to share from those years. Before I got into the incident with Nedo Al Sultan, which was that I remember being on the rooftops. This is what, 2009, so I've already discovered metal here. So, metal has extended the size of my testicles by quite a bit just from its rebellious nature,
Yeah.
and yeah, I was on the roof. We were on the rooftops, and then everyone is doing the chants, Ya Hussein, Mir Hussein, all of that stuff. And then me being, 14 at the time, I just turned around and said, Mark bar Khomeini, death to Khomeini. I said that. And when I said that, everyone around me turned around and said, Shayan, shh, no, don't say that. But then I was like, oh, okay. But that tells you everything that you need to know. That tells you everything. The fact that, like how we're still, you know what I equate this to? I was thinking about this earlier today when I was on a train journey. I was thinking about the conversation we're having. This whole idea of a reform is very much like, let's say, for example, you're in a toxic relationship that is not good for you, but then there comes the solution of, maybe you could stay with this person, but then if you adjusted things to a certain way, maybe if you moved into a different place or you got a cat or something, maybe things would be better then. But what you're really doing is just ignoring the fact that it's toxic for you to be with that person. It's just not working out, like this is not going to get better. And that very much is the case of the Islamic Republic, It's just, there has to be a cutoff. But what I want to discuss with you as someone who's an activist and you've seen so much of this, and you were obviously, as you just put, so affected by that. And like I said, I don't know how you can't be affected by it, and it mostly hurts when you know that the people experiencing this are people just like yourself,
And it could have been me, right? Like I'm I'm lucky that like my family escaped, right? Like it's one person's choice one person's choice that I could have been born in Iran and it could have been me.
So what do you think is the appropriate, from your perspective, from your experience, what do you think is the appropriate way to deal with this, should we say?
Yeah, so I think what has become very apparent, in 2009, you use that example saying, you chanted Magba Khamenei back then, which for those people who don't know what that means, it means death to Khamenei. 2009, people weren't saying that, right? Yeah. It was very much a reform movement. It was people thinking like we have a shot to like change things for the better, improve relations. And people thought that was like a realistic opportunity. I think the regime in many instances has used the idea of reform as a way to continue and ensure its survival. They give a little bit, right, for a few years, keep people quiet and content, and then they go back. Right?
They'll eventually encroach back into exactly
and then they come back and go back to where they were and worse. Right now, they just had a new hijab law passed in Iran.
Yep.
That is going to sentence women up to 10 years in prison for not wearing their hijab properly, and it will actually punish businesses and men also. Businesses who allow women who aren't wearing their hijab to come in to their place of business, or men who who show any part of the skin below the body. So they're going back even further and doubling down. So
and we should also point out the fact that they're using AI and facial recognition technology.
They're putting cameras, exactly.
Fines.
So in the past year, they've been installing cameras all over, in cities, to spy on people and be able to detect who that person is, so that they can find people who are not using AI to find people who are not following the law. So now, I think starting really in 2019, you had a series of protests which kind of resulted in, as a result of the rise of gas prices, you had a series of protests that resulted in many major deaths, very infamous incident where people really started saying death to the Islamic Republic. That is really the first time in 44 years you are seeing on a large scale a psychological shift that is taking place in Iran, where people are actually saying, not like we want change, no, like we want the Islamic Republic to to leave the country. And then with Gina's killing, it amplified itself on another level, where there has been, people are saying like, oh, the protests that have been taking place over the past year have died down, they've slowed down. That might be true for the time being, but there has been a psychological shift, in my opinion, in Iran, in what the people of Iran believe. Even some of the religious people who have historically like been okay with the regime, those people are becoming less and less psychologically attached to the regime, because it's so hard to rationalize women and children being killed in this way. Even those people have a problem with it, right? People who are religious. So that I think they've lost any sort of psychological advantage, which one day, whether it's, I don't think it's going to be the end of this year, maybe not even next year, that will, I think, over the course of time, have an impact. And their legitimacy has been completely lost. None of their propaganda works on the Iranian people anymore. So I don't think that is going to be sustainable long term, unless they are able to find they certainly have the will along the religious groups, but even the security forces were getting tired and worn down by the protests in the past year when they were at their peak. There's only so much money that can go around. So I think to pay these people, because a lot of the Basij and the security forces are just paid enforcers, people who are promised bread, olive oil, and stuff, food for their families, say, go do your Basij service. You might be a mechanic on your day job, but in the afternoons, you're going to go be a Basij person because we're going to help you get like bread and stuff for your family. This is how they convince people, right, to go do their bidding for them. Oftentimes it's not because and then the people in the Green Movement who were like the loyal, like ideological Basij commanders back then, those people have gotten older. They have families now. They don't want to necessarily go out and like risk their lives in the street fighting protesters. So I think that there are several factors in play that, although you don't see like mass protests happening in Iran and with the frequency as which they were the past year, this psychological shift is going to ultimately, in my opinion, lead to the ultimate downfall of the Islamic Republic at some point. And I think anyone who is at this point telling you that they believe in this idea of reform is a lie. Because the regime is not capable of it. They are, at its core, the regime is a cancer. You do not negotiate with cancer. You eradicate it with radiation is the way to treat it, right?
Yeah, and hopefully in the process you don't take out the host. I think that's the most
and that's what we hope for, right? We hope that, and I think there are lots of things that can potentially happen to help. And whether or not the regime will walk away without a fight, that we know that they won't. It's the degree to like the scale to which that will happen. One of the problems that we currently have is, so in Iran, you have conscription, which means you're required to do military service. And those people go into Artesh, which is the military of Iran. But Artesh is not nearly as well equipped. So they don't use Artesh to really crack down on protesters, because those are normal people who are required to do military service. The regime doesn't trust Artesh in order to crack down on protesters, because those people don't want to go beat their countrymen in the streets. So
it's the same thing I said earlier, is that you always have the psychology of the army siding with the people, but then the police and the other forces basically sticking to that. Yeah, I get. But
then you have a separate wing, right? The Revolutionary Guard and Sepah and the intelligence stuff, which are ideologically aligned, and they have. That's where all the most effective military equipment sits. The Islamic Republic has done a good job of kind of disarming Artesh in a way where they're disadvantaged compared to the IRGC, which has a huge, pretty sizable number of people who are part of it. It is critical in terms of solutions that we find ways to. Really quickly before I get to that, with the idea of reform. At this point in time, anyone who is pushing a reformist agenda is at best just extraordinarily naive. to think that these people will allow themselves to be reformed. For example, like, do you think they will ever lift mandatory hijab? Never. The only way it might ever get lifted, and the reason they won't is because that was the first thing that they did when they took power, is they put hijabs on all women. Because if you oppress women in this way, you will gain control. It's a way of gaining control. It is a symbol of their existence and their legitimacy and their survival, and it's written into their constitution. If the mullahs ever agree to lift hijab, they've basically said, they've basically admitted themselves that they are not legitimate. So it's at the core of who they are, right?
It's very interesting that you bring that up, because I had that exact same conversation with a very close friend of mine who's still in Iran about a year ago, and we were talking about that, and I said to him, I said, do you think that just since people are pushing now and people are not taking it, at least they'll get rid of hijab and then maybe people will go back to it? And he said, and I immediately agree with him. He said that if they do that, they're no longer the Islamic Republic.
Exactly. The only way it might happen, I told you that a lot of the people in positions, so the IRGC, SEPA and stuff, some of these people are ideologically aligned, but a lot of them are just like a mafia, right? They're corrupt. Mm-hmm. They only care about power. When Khamenei dies, which, part of me wants that to happen like as soon as possible. Another part of me like wants him to be like tried in a court, like in front of the entire country. But if the question of his successor, if that is not a peaceful transition, and the IRGC, which is extremely powerful in Iran, which is where a lot of the power rests in the Islamic Republic, wants to like impose some sort of like military type rule, right, that's run by the IRGC, I could see them potentially going in, because you have the mullahs, which are like the religious fanatics, but then you have the IRGC, which is a military group that is power hungry. You have mafia like gang members basically running the show over there, and people who have like with a military background. I could see them wanting to take power in the country and lifting the hijab as a form of appeasement, just to because they might not necessarily care about the ideological side of it, as long as they're able to maintain their grip on power and money and things like that. Those are maybe the only circumstances, but I think at the end of the day, these ideas that they will give on these like reforms is laughable to me. So at best, anyone who thinks that reform is possible is extremely naive. Anyone else, at worst, you are an apologist for the regime. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think you are correct.
You are an apologist, or you are using, actually that's maybe the middle ground. At worst, you are actually weaponizing the idea of reform as a strategic move to ensure the survival. If you keep people believing that reform is possible, then they might be more content, or like more, they might, as a form of appeasement, they might like be a little bit more docile and think, oh, there's hope. We don't need to go protest because there's hope. It's bullshit.
It is. And you know what's really fucked up? This was an idea I had pretty much, like when the riots and things started going full-fledged last year, I was like, holy shit, this might be it, but one thing that I thought, and I still think about this, and it pisses me off that this could be true, because obviously it's a subject that I'm sure for yourself living in America is very much like a first-hand experience of it, and I think it's a double-edged sword at best. But don't you think if Iranians had access to something like the First Amendment, that government would have toppled by October last year?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, because like it's so hard to predict how these things might like turn out. Obviously, it would be a much bloodier situation. I think one of the concerns I have with, as much as I hate the Islamic Republic, one of the concerns I have with like a form of armed conflict is if you actually look at some of the studies, and maybe that's what it takes. Again, I don't know. I really don't know. But there are studies to support the fact that if your objective is to have a revolution that results in a democracy, the history shows that those countries with peaceful, nonviolent revolutions are statistically more likely to result in an actual democracy after the fact. When you have violent revolutions, you have issues with, vengeance, revenge, and it's very painful. It's very traumatic. Again, I don't know what it would take. I think at the end of the day, like when I see, I'm not going to cry over seeing, we've had assassinations of regime like commanders, people in the Basij. I'm certainly not going to cry over that or be upset at that.
I feel very, very insensitive towards that. Like even, like even like last year, there was that thing where they found one of the imams or some guy and just like stabbed the shit out of him to death, and that was, to me, I was like, there's that part of you that's like, oh, that's someone's son, that's someone's child.
I don't really think about that, to be honest.
No, but there is that. No, I think that at first, but then there's the thought of, yeah, but look at everything else, and then it's kind of like, well, it's sort of like that's how I look at it. To me, maybe it's just me personally, but automatically I always think of that. Even if someone wrongs me personally, I always think, well, what happened to you? Why did you have you had to do this? But then, there's the principle, and I think that's where it comes to the fact that, like you said, if these guys went, we wouldn't have to cry about it. But also, I want to say this as well, because this is very important, because we Iranians, we just want to fucking have a good time, and
not
have a laugh,
We're not violent.
Exactly. This is why. Like when I first moved to the UK, and then sometimes people around me would joke about like Iranians being terrorists. I would be like, Iranians are pussycats. We would be the last people who would be terrorists. We're like, like a mosquito bites us. We're like, oh no, like this hurts. Like, obviously I don't want to paint us in a bad picture, but
the regime will pay people to be terrorists. Look at Hezbollah as a perfect example, right?
Of course. I'm talking about the Iranian temperament. Yeah. And what we're actually like as people. We just like to dance. We just like to have good food. We just like to have a good time. We're not people, which is why, partially probably why these cunts have been in power for as long as they have been, because we just kind of want to go along to get along and, just be nice and think about poetry and things like that, But then, what this concerns me with is that study that you just mentioned. That's very interesting. But also it becomes kind of scary because you say that, generally in those situations, the populations that will, or whenever there's like a revolution that takes place that's peaceful, at least, will then, is statistically more likely to have democracy in it afterwards. That makes me very concerned because they're not going to go peacefully.
And I struggle with that as well. And that's the thing is, I don't know that there's ever been, you can look at, and I've thought about this too. I look at those studies, and one of the issues I have is thinking, well, have any of those revolutions been in the face of a regime like this, right? A regime that is founded on the principles that the Islamic Republic is, as I said, worships violence and death in the way that they do. I can't say that I know what the right answer is. What I do know is that I, as a Iranian American sitting in the safety of my own home in the West, I will never go tell Iranians this is what you should do in terms of risking your life. I cannot have people's blood on my hands, right? I will never say to Iranians, go raid a Basij base, take up guns, and start shooting any Basij member you see. I can't in good conscience do that because I know what the toll is, and I'm not in a position to make that sort of decision because I'm safe and comfortable, and I will not have the blood of my countrymen on my hands. So like, I don't know what the right answer is. I do know that there are a few things that I think in terms of, what's going on outside of Iran that do need to happen is, the United States just struck a $6 billion deal with the Islamic Republic where We got 5 hostages that were held by the Islamic Republic in exchange for giving them some prisoners. I would not call the people we were holding in the U.S. as hostages. They were prisoners, people who were caught committing crimes on behalf of the Islamic Republic. And then we gave them $6 billion in exchange for it. This is a form of ransom and hostage diplomacy that is now putting money directly into the pockets of the regime. And that we say that the money can only be used by Iran for humanitarian purposes, which is absolutely laughable to me, right? Like that they're going to have controls in place and it's going to be used to buy humanitarian things that will be used for Iran's need. The president of Iran himself said, we're going to use the money however we want. And even if it is just like delivered to them in the form of like products, those products can be sold, can be used for like other means. And this is money that is going directly, people will like to say, oh, but that's Iran's money. It's money that they have from my perspective, stolen from the Iranian people. It's frozen in, accounts outside of Iran, and money that is used to fund their terrorist activities outside of Iran and their oppression of people in Iran. So one thing we need to do is completely cut off any sort of support, financial support that will enable their continued survival. And even in Iran with that deal, for example, as the deal was happening, there were more hostages being taken by the regime. And you had people, part of the regime, giving public speeches in Iran saying, we should take more hostages because every time we take one of these hostages, the United States will pay us for it. They'll give us more money.
What I find very interesting and in alignment with that is when you look up the sort of, when you sort of observe the comments and the general morale of Iranians, I think possibly both inside and outside of Iran, towards Trump, a lot of them at this point seem very positive. Like a lot of Iranians actually seem to be fans of him. And I'm very intrigued by that dynamic, because you look at, like you said, like what's going on now, and then you compare that to, let's say, 2016, 17, when some of his policies were put in place, which initially pissed off everyone. But now you can see that Iranians are actually taking his side, saying that, yeah, fuck the Islamic Republic. Stop doing business with these criminals. What's your take on that?
So I'm going to speak for my personal views, right? Yes, I think there's been an increase in popularity of President Trump among Iranians, especially those who really can only see their hatred for the regime. And I understand that. I think if you are looking to Republicans or Democrats as outside of Iran as providers of solutions for Iran, you will be sorely disappointed. These people are not going to save Iran, and they do not care about Iran. People will say, oh, but Trump, Democrats are, I think, so politically invested in the nuclear deal with Iran that withdrawing from that, like ideologically, it's going to be an embarrassment for them. And admitting the faults for them is something that politically
very true. Yes, remember when Obama was wishing us a happy Nowruz?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of photo ops and stuff like that. Now, I've struggled with this a lot because I am sorely disappointed by both sides. I think Republicans have a group of people who historically are just really looking after their own interests. Some of them have been paid off by the MEK, that Islamic fascist sect that is opposed to the Republic, but is also their own terrorist group. They have had links to the MEK, and you cannot trust those people at all. In the case of Trump, a lot of people will claim, oh, but he killed Qasem Soleimani. For people who don't know who that is, he was one of the top commanders for the Revolutionary Guard, major political and military figure that is beloved by the Islamic Republic, and he was killed in Iraq and part of an offensive that many people were afraid might lead to a military confrontation between the United States and Iran. his death was widely celebrated by people who hate the Islamic Republic. I am frankly thrilled that he is dead. With that said, what is that a win? Sure, yes. But am I going to praise Donald Trump for that win? If you're asking me, I think it's very likely that Donald Trump did not know who Qasem Soleimani was until an hour before he was killed. Again, I don't know the details of it, but I would not be surprised if you told Trump to point to Iran in a map that he would not know where it is. He probably had the intel. Again, I'm speculating here, so don't take this as fact. But the way I perceive in terms of how much he actually cares about the interests of Iranians, probably had Mossad tell him, hey, this bad guy is like there at this point in time. If you want to kill him, he's right there. And he's like, yeah, I'll do that. That's fine. Who is he? I don't know. But like, could be a political win. Donald Trump does not do anything unless it's in his own political interests. I do not think he is led by a strategy towards Iran, an ideology towards Iran, or what Iran should be. If the regime promised Donald Trump a hotel in the middle of Tehran, in a week, you'd have Donald Trump praising Khamenei and saying whatever he needed to do. So like, I don't look to these people as any form of guidance for what is right for Iran, and they are certainly not the saviors of it, because you had Donald Trump praising Vladimir Putin, who is an ally of the regime. He's praised Kim Jong-un as an oppressor of his own people, talking about how impressive his whatever is. He's complimented him in many ways. This is not someone that you can trust to look out for your best interest. No, put your faith in the Iranian people, in our culture and our values and our philosophies. Do not put your faith in these Western leaders who have to be accountable to their own interest in the West, and oftentimes are only interested in their own ego. They have their own egos and their own self-interest. The only thing that we have this phrase that has been coming up quite a bit among activist circles is when we're talking to Western governments is, we don't need you to save the Iranian people. We need you to stop saving the Islamic regime that oppresses them. Stop giving them lifelines. Stop creating the conditions in Iran that allow them to continue to flourish, and let the Iranian people handle the rest.
I appreciate that, but I think that's because the tricky thing is that the Islamic Republic represents Iran, and I'm sure that the Western powers are aware of really the cancer that the Islamic Republic is, but I think that a very important point that you mentioned this, and I think you put this down very well, is I think that for Iran to really survive, and I think everyone can probably agree on this, is that the issue of Islamic Republic needs to be handled internally, not by external forces.
Yeah, the outside foreign interference does not have a good record in Iran, and the Iranian people themselves, I'm fairly confident, would not want to see, some sort of military intervention in Iran. We've seen what's happened in Iraq, in Libya, and we see what Assad is doing in his own people. But I will say, I think one of the major challenges we have is the outside world, and especially Western powers are likely okay with the status quo. They know their enemy, right? They know who's in power. They don't know what comes after. And there's a lot of things working against, getting them to cooperate with the current women life freedom revolution. Saudi Arabia, for example, I don't think is invested in seeing a free Iran. It puts their own authority in question if Iran is now like a democracy or a republic of some kind. Also, Iran could become back open for business with the rest of the world if it's a free Iran. And that's an economic threat to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a lot of influence and political capital and money in the world. So we have a uphill.
Also, fuck Saudi Arabia, just so we're clear.
Yeah, I mean they've certainly done a lot to not make conditions, in terms of our ability to negotiate, have the revolution, have a voice, and negotiate with the Western world. I think there are plenty of reasons that a free Iran is beneficial for the world. The support to Russia. Iran is now supporting Russia, right? Rather than Russia supporting Iran, Iran is now sending drones to Russia to attack Ukraine, right?
Well, didn't Khamenei do a $40 billion deal with Putin?
He's done. He's probably done more than that.
No, I'm pretty sure there was a fairly recent one in like the last few months.
Yeah, and then you have the support of militant Shiite groups like Hezbollah and other areas. The support for Assad. If free Iran will drastically change the economic and social landscape of the Middle East, in my opinion, for the good. It's just getting the outside world to somehow buy in to this idea, so that they can help, start getting to a point where, like I said, they're incentivized to no longer provide these lifelines to the regime. We don't want them to go in and start like interfering directly, but not providing help and giving and starting to recognize ideologically that the Islamic Republic is not the representative of Iran, right? They've lost legitimacy. One of the reasons Jimmy Carter had turned his back on the Shah was because he has gotten to a point where he sees, and he probably looked at it as, the guy's lost any sort of legitimacy from his own people. It's no matter what I do, whether he was right or not. I think this is probably the calculus that was going on in his head. He turned his back on him because he probably thought there was no turning back. We have to make the rest of the world understand that there is no turning back from this revolution, that the people have given up on the Islamic Republic and no longer recognizes their legitimacy. And whether you like it or not, they are on their way out.
It's the case of when someone is on the ground in a fight, that person has no forgiveness over the other person that's got the upper hand. But as soon as that dynamic changes, that person who's currently on the ground is going to take on the other person. And I think that the person on the ground being the people, I think that's very much the dynamic between the people and the Islamic Republic. It's sort of like, we've got our eyes on you. As soon as there is an opportunity, we're coming after you. And I think that's what's happening. But what would be extremely unfortunate, and what would be very much, I think, in the favor of the Islamic Republic to an extent, because, like you said, they're death worshippers. They almost seem to fetishize death and dying and martyrdom. I think what scares me is that these are the people who control the weapons in that region, which is a lot. Okay? And what would be terrifying to me is if they get close to the edge where they're like, well, our time might be limited here, then if they start a war or something, or if they start a nuclear situation, because you also have to think that Iran will probably, the moment it realize, not Iran, but the Islamic Republic, the moment they realize they gotta go, they will probably try and take Israel out with them in the process. At least this is my very naive and basic understanding of where they stand.
I think if they, they might try to create some certain like false flag type situations to like divert the attention of the Iranian people. I don't know that the Iranian people are going to fall for that kind of crap. This is also highlights the reason why defections are going to be so important. Like I said, a lot of their support comes from paying groups. They do actually also bring in Shiite militias from Iraq to come into when they're dry on resources in terms of personnel to help enforce. But this is why cutting off their financial lifelines is so important, is because you do need to pay for these things. And another really critical thing is being able to find ways from a technical perspective and a legal perspective to get outside governments to help fund strike, like help the revolutionary Iranians outside of Iran to help fund strikes inside of Iran, because Their current lifeline, for example, is their industry, where they get their money and they depend on their survival. The Islamic Republic is from the oil and gas industry. So if you can have a period of sustained strikes, you can cripple them economically, where they can't even afford to pay the people that they would use to encourage. This would help encourage defections. So if they can't get money to buy the things that they need, right? I think you're on a tight. One of the things that was Reza Pahlavi's downfall was mass general strikes that crippled him economically, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So these type of things, if we can get the tools that we need to be able to make this sustainable, because at the end of the day, people still need to eat. They need to have a roof over their heads. They need to be able to buy groceries, which is why they need to go to work. But if we can find ways to help make these strikes sustainable, you're cutting off a critical lifeline of the regime that is going to be necessary for them to even fund their offensive against the Iranian people who are trying to have a revolution. Because if I'm a Basij member and I'm only going and beating protesters over the head with batons or killing them because there's food, on the other side of that, there's food for me and my family. Well, if the regime can no longer provide that, there's a lot less incentives, right? These people, if I guarantee you, a lot of the people that the regime uses, you have IRGC, which is military, it's different, but we're talking about the militias and some of the people that are paid, enforcers of the regime. If someone was to offer them a bounty to go kill their own commander, which I'm not saying we should do, I'm just saying hypothetically to speak to what their motives are, to go kill their own commander, and then they will get an award for it, those people will do it. They operate like a gang, right? There's a lot of people that the regime uses and as a form of weaponry, and some of these people are also drugged, right? They use drugs to actually make them go insane so they can go kill people. So they were actually sending these drugs to Syria, and Assad was using these drugs to turn his own people into mindless killing machines with no sorts of empathy. It's well documented.
What kind of drugs? That sounds a lot like meth, but I'm guessing I think it's
similar. It's these type of drugs that take them into this psychosis type state that make them go fucking crazy. And if you actually go look at a lot of the I know people who I have some family friends who know people in Iran, where this woman's son all of a sudden started getting really angry, and then randomly starts joining, and he starts getting into this these crazy things, and he's getting angrier and angrier at home, and his mother is extremely concerned. And then he's starting to hang out with all these Basiji type people, and he gets to this point where this was a really a good kid, a nice kid. He's kind of losing his mind, and he has this psychotic break, and his mom takes him to the hospital, and they find every single drug you can imagine in this kid's system. So they put these young kids under the influence of really scary drugs and turn and pump these ideas into their brain to turn them into these crazy basically mindless weapons. But other people are just people that are being paid. So one of the major solutions, I think, in terms of having a successful revolution that can help cripple the regime, including in its ability to crack down on protesters, is take their money.
Yeah.
We've destroy their access to money.
Yeah. Well, Parsa, listen, brother, what a fucking pleasure it has been to have you on here. I very much value your insight and our conversation here, and I hope it's been good for people to hear about this. It feels to me as if I need to get you back on here again at some point, and because
I would love to. Yeah, I mean, it's been. I'd love to talk to you. We could go for so long. I know it's been a while, but one thing I do want to say, and I wanted to mention this actually at the beginning is one, I wanted to congratulate you about finally releasing Trivax's new album.
Thanks.
I listened to it and it was incredible. We didn't talk about the fact that I am a fan of black metal. I was friends with Scott Taysom, as I mentioned. I played in a punk band with him. Growing up, my first introductions to black metal were Dissection and Watain and these bands, which I know you're a fan of. And I listened to your album yesterday for the first time, and it was incredible. Obviously, we've had some of the singles, Serpent's Gaze, was it Triumphant Death?
Twilight of Death.
Twilight of Death.
Second to last track. Yeah.
Those two tracks were incredible. And just for me as an Iranian, I grew up in the South. I was, you don't have many Iranians like in the South of the United States, like listening to black metal. And, Iran has obscure black metal bands that have come out of it, right? Many people probably don't know about them, but I have never heard a black metal band from Iran that has taken it to the level that you guys have taken it to, and the sophistication. So for me, for me, Iranian art is so important because it's something that the regime is trying to suppress every day. The ability to express yourself through art, and to see Iranians take on this form of music and bring it to its level. In my opinion, while we've had some black metal bands, and all the respect in the world to those bands, they are all I respect what they have all done. This to me is like actually a historical moment for Iranian art, to see this album released and to have taken it to the international like level, seeing people outside of Iran engaging with it in this way, and then to talk thematically about it. It is for me a moment in Iran's like artistic and musical history, and it means so much to me to see something like that being released. Because I know what it's like to be, an Iranian who likes black metal, to kind of be in this, these different worlds, these subcultures and stuff like that. So I'm very proud of the album that you guys have put out as an Iranian and just as a fan of black metal, along with Cloak's album. These are the two albums of the year for me. So it was incredible. And thank you for putting that out and for putting so much effort and love into that. I know it took a while for you guys to finally release it, but I'm very excited about it.
Thank you so much, brother. I'm humbled to hear your words, and I really appreciate that. And to me, obviously the way I observe art is that it's fucking want to get it out of your system. That's the thing. That's the success. It's successful if you're able to properly express yourself and put out something that you can look at and think, that's honest, that represents how I feel, and it's executed in a way that that represents our standards and what we're able to do. And so to me, this album's a big success. But then it makes it so much more rewarding to hear that side of things as well. And the thing for me is, as a musician, not to go on a massive tangent here, but since you brought it up, as a musician, for me, I'm always aware of my background. I'm always thinking of my home, where I've come from, the many people who have been besides me, who, now that I'm here, I am able to express myself, but they are not. So I take responsibility, not just for, let's say, my own legacy or the band's legacy, but for everyone who I shared those underground rehearsal rooms with, for everyone who I met who was wearing their bootleg Death and Sepultura t-shirts, but not just them in the metal community, but for everyone who's on the streets fighting for their freedom, just so they can have a normal life, whatever that even really is, but just so that they can have freedom of speech. I do everything that I do it for them. I do it for my family. I do it, so this is sort of like, there is a drive, I think, behind Trivax that perhaps might be different to probably most artists in the world, because the background is just different. There's an intent behind it that's different, and it's a matter of life and death. It always has been that way, very much so. And and at the end of the day, we're just playing music, we're just expressing ourselves, so it doesn't always have to be that deep, but it is in
It
our
is.
case. And I really appreciate hearing what you had to say, especially not just relating it to black metal, but to art in general, because that's how I also look at it as well. To me, it surpasses genres, and it's a human story more than anything.
Absolutely. 100%. And I mean, it is a lot it is not just art, like it's not just like playing music. Like when you have the experience of what it's like to have that suppressed for decades, it is about our identity, our like the self, like our souls, and like who we are, and being able to live freely and to express that. Putting it's like the ultimate fuck you to anyone who would oppress who you are and try to enslave you, whether it's mentally or physically. So
Precisely.
all for it.
Yes, absolutely, man. Very well put. Parsa, as we wrap things up here, do you want to let our audience know what they can, what have you got coming up that they can check out, or if there are ways that you think our audience might be able to help the people in Iran, if there's anything they can do, if there's any kind of movements, if there's any kind of raising awareness, what can people do to help this cause?
Yeah, I mean, so there's lots of things, and it feels like every week there are new like kind of calls to action. One is to just try to stay up to date with the what's going on in Iran. When you hear about people whose lives are at risk, share their names, because the regime does surprisingly hesitate to execute people who, when it's going to draw a lot of international attention. So this is a situation where bringing awareness to specific people who are at risk can actually save their life. So say their names, share it, post things on social media. If you want to follow along with like regular like updates and action items, I would go to the Azadi Daily Instagram page, and we'll consistently post things. That's at azadi.daily. And then
they'll all be in the description as well for people
perfect.
who want to have a look. Yeah.
And then also the Nimruz organization that we're hoping to kind of get off the ground and bring more attention to Iranian culture and identity and values, not the values of the Islamic Republic. So follow along with that, because we're hopefully going to have a lot more great content coming through that as well.
That's amazing. Brother, thank you so much for your time and this conversation tonight. I really appreciate it. And here's hoping, but not just hoping, but taking responsibility for better days. That's what I'll say.
Absolutely. Zan Zendegi Azadi, woman life freedom.
Zan Zendegi Azadi. Yes. To everyone here who's been listening to the episode so far, thank you guys for joining us. I don't think there's anything more to add to it than that. Okay? We'll see you on the next episode. Like Parsa said, Zan Zendegi Azadi.